Welcome back, hey, my dear friends. Tonight we're traveling back in time, not to the shining castles and candlelit feasts you might picture when someone says Madhyakalin, but down to the streets below. The muddy, crowded, gloriously stinky streets of a Madhyakalin town somewhere in Europe, around, let's say, the year 130. You're standing at the edge of a narrow lane, just as the sun starts to sink behind a row of timber-framed buildings. The light is golden. The shadows are long, and the smell is something no history book has ever quite captured properly. You take a breath. That's your first mistake. What hits you first isn't one thing, but a layered attack. Something animal. Something rotting. Something sharp and chemical. Something almost sweet in the worst possible way, like fruit that has gone very, very wrong. There's mud beneath your feet, but you already suspect it's not entirely mud. A pig trots past you with the confidence of someone who owns the place, which, honestly, in this era, kinda does. A woman dumps a bucket's contents from a second-floor window without warning, and you step back just in time. Just in time. A group of children run barefoot down the lane, laughing, completely unfazed, because this is just Tuesday for them. Welcome to Madhyakalin urban life. You probably won't survive this, not because anyone wants to hurt you, but because your 21st century nostrils simply aren't ready for what the next few hours will demand of them. Tonight, we're diving deep into one of history's most overlooked sensory experiences, why Madhyakalin cities and towns smelled the way they did, what created those smells, who had to deal with them most directly, and how people actually lived and surprisingly thrived inside what modern noses would call an unmitigated disaster. It's a story about infrastructure, about animals, about the human body, about trade, about religion, and about the surprisingly clever ways people tried to cope with a world that hadn't yet invented the sewer, the soap dispenser, or the concept of municipal waste management. It's also quietly a story about us, because the gap between their world and ours is shorter than we like to think, and the ingenuity required to live inside it was genuinely remarkable. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below. Tell me where you are in the world right now, and what your local time is. There's something genuinely lovely about knowing that someone in Auckland, and someone in Aberdeen, and someone in Sao Paulo are all drifting off to the same story at the same moment. It makes the world feel a little smaller, a little warmer. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're still standing at the edge of that narrow lane. The pig has gone around the corner. The golden light is fading. Somewhere above you, a shutter creaks open and a candle flickers to life in a window. The town is settling into its evening rhythm. Traders closing their stalls. Apprentices sweeping sawdust out of doorways. A dog nosing at something in the gutter that you choose not to identify. The sounds are softer now. Voices carry from inside buildings. Someone is cooking something, and underneath the smell of wood smoke and whatever is in that pot, the city's deeper odors rise up like a bass note in a song. Constant, foundational, inescapable. This is the smell of a living, breathing, working human settlement without any of the systems we now take for granted. There are no underground pipes carrying waste away. There is no clean water running from a tap. There's no garbage collection truck coming on Wednesday morning. Everything that goes into this city, every animal, every person, every product, every piece of food stays in this city until something or someone moves it. And the moving, as you'll soon discover, is a job nobody wanted. But before we get to the people who dealt with the worst of it, it helps to understand just how a Madhyakalin town was laid out and why its very design made the smell not just inevitable, but architectural. The streets were narrow by necessity because city walls were expensive to build and maintain, so everyone crowded inside them, building upward when they couldn't build outward. Upper floors of timber buildings jutted out over lower floors, so that the top of the street was almost a tunnel of overhanging wood and plaster. Sunlight barely reached the ground. Airflow was minimal. Whatever accumulated at street level, and a great deal accumulated at street level, had very little chance to disperse. This wasn't because Madhyakalin people were ignorant or careless. Scholars still debate whether the people of this era had a clear understanding of disease transmission. But what is clear is that they were practical, adaptable, and working with what they had. They built cities that served commerce, defense, and community, and they managed the consequences as best they could. Tonight, you're going to see exactly what those consequences were, and somewhere between the gong farmers and the tanning pits and the spectacularly unfortunate cesspit accidents, you might find yourself drifting somewhere quiet and restful. Lulled not despite the strangeness of this world, but somehow because of it. Because there's something deeply, oddly soothing about the past when you let it wash over you. Something that says, people have always found a way. People have always made a home, even in the most improbable places. The candle in the window above you gutters in a small breeze. The pig, apparently, is coming back. Let's begin. You're still on that narrow lane, and the evening is deepening around you. The last traders are pulling their awnings down, and the smell that was merely noticeable an hour ago is now, in the cooling air, becoming something more concentrated, more insistent, like the city itself is exhaling after a long day of holding it, in which, in a way, it is. To understand why Madhikaleen streets smelled the way they did, you need to start at the most fundamental level. Not with animals or butchers or tanning pits, but with the basic question of where things went. In your world, waste has an architecture. There are systems beneath your feet, invisible and largely unthought about, that carry away everything you flush, drain, or discard. The moment something leaves your hands, it enters a network pipes, treatment plants, collection schedules that removes it from your sensory experience almost instantly. You never have to think about it. That invisibility is so complete that most people in the modern world have genuinely never considered what a triumph of engineering it represents. In a Madhikaleen town, there is no such architecture. There is no beneath. The ground under your feet isn't a ceiling above a system of pipes. It's just ground, earth comp, acted by centuries of footfall, mixed with everything that has ever been dropped, spilled, or thrown onto it. What goes down stays down, unless it rains enough to wash it somewhere else. And somewhere else almost always means the nearest ditch, the nearest stream, or slightly farther down the same street. This isn't failure of imagination. It's a failure of infrastructure. And infrastructure requires things that Madhikaleen towns often simply didn't have centralized authority willing to spend money on, things that benefited everyone, but were owned by no one. Engineering knowledge at sufficient scale, materials, labor, and perhaps most importantly, a conceptual framework that connected waste management to public health in a direct, actionable way. Some of these things existed in partial forms. Others were centuries away. What Madhikaleen towns had instead was a patchwork of arrangements, customs, and individual responsibilities that varied enormously from place to place and decade to decade. In some larger cities, there were designated areas, specific streets or zones where certain types of waste were supposed to be deposited. There were officials, at least nominally, charged with keeping the streets passable. There were bylaws, sometimes remarkably detailed ones, about what could be thrown where and when. But enforcement was irregular at best, and the gap between what the rules said and what actually happened was wide enough to drive a cart through which people did constantly. Because the streets also served as the primary route for every vehicle carrying every product in and out of the city. And those carts left their own contributions as they went. The physical layout of a typical Madhikaleen town made the waste problem almost geometrically worse. You can imagine it as a series of concentric pressures. The town wall creates a fixed boundary. You can't expand outward without enormous expense and political negotiation. So the population inside that boundary grows denser over time. More people means more waste. More waste in the same fixed space means higher concentrations. Higher concentrations mean more smell, more disease vectors, more of everything. And the narrow streets that were sensible for defense and community cohesion become channels that trap everything at ground level, shaded from sun and starved of breeze. The ground itself in a busy Madhikaleen town was a kind of archaeological record of daily life, compressed and layered. Excavations of Madhyakaleen urban sites have found street-level deposits containing animal dung, human waste, food scraps, ash, hair, broken pottery, straw, and the remains of small animals, all compacted together into what archaeologists sometimes call a dark earth layer. This is the literal ground you're walking on. It's soft in places. It gives slightly underfoot. You've decided not to think too hard about why. Households were responsible for managing their own waste in whatever way they could arrange. For liquid waste, the contents of chamber pots. The runoff from cooking and washing, the standard practice in most towns was simply to throw it into the street. There was often a customary warning, a shout from the window before the contents of a pot came down. And in some places, this was actually codified. You were supposed to call out 3 times before emptying anything from an upper window. Whether people consistently did this is a matter that history diplomatically doesn't fully record. Solid waste presented a more complex problem. Households with any space at all often maintained a cesspit, a hole in the ground, sometimes lined with stone or brick, sometimes simply dug into the earth where solid waste accumulated. These needed to be emptied periodically, and we'll spend considerable time tomorrow night with the remarkable men who did that work. For now, it's enough to know that cesspits varied enormously in quality and maintenance. A well-built, regularly emptied cesspit in a prosperous household was a genuine piece of infrastructure. An old, neglected, overflowing cesspit in a crowded tenement was something else entirely, a slow-motion catastrophe seeping quietly into the surrounding soil, contaminating nearby wells, contributing its own deep, particular note to the city's ambient atmosphere. The problem of wells is worth pausing on for a moment, because it connects waste management directly to something people cared about with great urgency: drinking water. In a town without piped water, the well was everything. Public wells, shared wells, private wells, all drawing from the same groundwater table that the cesspits, dung hills, and animal yards were continuously recharging with their contents. Scholars still debate whether Madhyakaleen people understood the specific mechanism by which contaminated water caused illness, but they did observe the correlation in practical terms, and records show genuine anxiety about wells being corrupted by nearby cesspits or drainage from tanning operations. Some towns attempted to create distance rules about how close a cesspit could be to a well, regulations about which industries could operate near water sources. These were sensible ideas, imperfectly applied. The distances specified were often too small to actually prevent contamination. Enforcement was inconsistent, and the sheer density of urban life meant that in practice, everything was close to everything else. And the groundwater beneath a Madhyakaleen town was a complicated cocktail of whatever was happening at street level. You step carefully around something in your path. The evening air is cooling, and in the cooling, it is, if anything, getting worse. Because warmer air disperses smells upward and outward, and cooler air does the opposite. It settles. It holds. The smell of a Madhyakaleen street in the evening is the smell of everything the day has produced, concentrating gently at nose level as the temperature drops. Somewhere nearby, someone is dumping ash from a hearth into a lane. Ash was actually useful. It helped dry out wet, muddy surfaces and had some deodorizing effect, and people knew that. Small, practical adaptations to the reality of the street were everywhere if you knew where to look. That's something you'll keep noticing as this night goes on: the ingenuity of ordinary people managing an extraordinary set of conditions with the tools they had. But for now, the ash settles in a pale drift across the dark ground, and somewhere in the shadows ahead, something is moving. It is large, and it smells of itself, and it is in no particular hurry to move out of your way. You have just met the other half of the urban waste problem. The large shape in the shadows ahead of you resolves as you get closer into a horse, specifically into the back end of a horse, which is, in this context, the least welcoming angle of approach. It's tethered outside what appears to be a tavern, and it has been there long enough to have made its presence known to the surrounding feet of street in a way that is both visual and olfactory, and if you're not watching where you step, tactile. You give it a wide berth and turn down a side lane, and that's when the smell changes again, becomes something deeper, something that has been cooking for a long time, something that lives not at street level, but slightly below it, rising up through gaps in the ground and through the walls of the low building at the end of the lane, where a single lantern burns with a smoky, determined light. You have found, more or less by accident, the residence of a gong farmer. Or rather, you have found the end of the lane where a gong farmer lives, which is as close as most of his neighbors prefer to get. And honestly, standing here at this distance, you're beginning to understand their position entirely. The gong farmer, also called a gong firmer, a night man, a night soil man, or in some records by a variety of terms that the PG-13 format of this particular evening does not permit, was one of the most essential and most socially invisible workers in Madhyakaleen urban life. His job, stated plainly, was to empty cesspits, the private cesspits and communal cesspits of households, tenements, monasteries, taverns, and public facilities, all required periodic emptying. And the emptying couldn't happen by itself. It required a person, or more often a small crew of people, to physically enter or reach into the pit, remove its contents by bucket or shovel, load those contents onto a cart, and transport them out of the city to be sold or deposited at designated locations outside the walls. This work happened at night. That's where the nightman name comes from. And the reason for the nocturnal schedule wasn't mysterious. It was an attempt to minimize the additional disruption to the already considerable atmosphere of a Madhyakaleen street. Cesspits, when opened and disturbed, released gases and odors that were, by all surviving accounts, dramatically worse than their ambient state. Owing this work during daylight hours in a busy street was considered, with remarkable understatement, antisocial. So the gong farmers worked from roughly 9 or 10 at night until 5 in the morning by lantern light, in the narrow yards behind houses or in the lanes between buildings, doing work that most of their contemporaries couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge in direct daylight. The tools of the trade were basic buckets, shovels, ropes for lowering equipment into deep pits, and the cart, always the cart waiting at the end of the lane with its barrel or open bed, which would be taken through the city gates before sunrise, its contents deposited in the dung heaps outside town. These dung heaps weren't simply waste sites. They were, in a very practical sense, a resource. Night soil, the polite historical term for the contents of cesspits, was valuable as agricultural fertilizer, and farmers outside town would pay for it, or at least accept it, which helped offset the cost of removal for urban householders. There was, in other words, an economy here, a small, pungent, nocturnal economy with its own supply chain, pricing structures, and professional culture. Pay for the time and the work involved was actually reasonably good. Records from London and other English cities suggest that gong farmers earned significantly more per day than a common laborer, sometimes 2 or 3 times the standard wage. This makes a certain blunt economic sense. The supply of people willing to do the work was limited, and the demand was constant, so the price of labor rose accordingly. A skilled team of nightmen who worked efficiently caused minimal disruption, and could handle the more technically challenging cesspits, the deep ones, the ones with structural problems. The ones in tight spaces could build a reputation and a client base over years, but the money came with costs that went beyond the obvious. Gong farmers occupied a strange and specifically defined place in the social landscape of Madhyakaleen towns. They were necessary. Everyone understood they were necessary. The town literally couldn't function without them. Cesspits left unemptied would overflow, collapse, contaminate wells, and generate conditions that even by Madhyakaleen standards were recognized as a crisis. And yet the social status of the gong farmer was consistently low, consistently marginalized, consistently marked by physical and symbolic separation from the rest of urban society. In some towns, gong farmers were required to live in specific areas outside the main residential quarters, near the city walls or beyond them, in the same neighborhoods as other workers, whose trades were considered polluting or noxious. They were restricted in some cases from entering certain public spaces or practicing trades during daylight hours in ways that might involve contact with food or drinking establishments. The smell that clung to them, and it did cling persistently, despite whatever washing was possible, marked them as a separate category of person in society where such markings carried real social weight. There is something genuinely complicated about this that historians have spent considerable time examining. Scholars still debate whether the social marginalization of night soil workers represents a coherent ideological system, a ritual pollution framework, as some anthropologists would frame it, or whether it was simply a practical response to the very real problem of someone who smells extremely strongly working in close quarters with people who would prefer not to experience that. Probably it was both, tangled together in the way that practical arrangements and cultural meanings usually are. What is certain is that the gong farmers knew their own worth. In the records that survive court documents, guild records, municipal accounts, you can sometimes catch a glimpse of men who negotiated their rates firmly, who organized themselves into working teams with clear internal hierarchies, who passed the trade from father to son across generations. It was, for all its discomforts, a livelihood, a specific, skilled, transmissible livelihood. The cesspits themselves varied so widely that experienced gong farmers developed genuine expertise in categorizing and approaching them. A domestic cesspit in a modest household might be relatively small, perhaps 6 feet deep, a few feet across, emptied every year or two if the household was diligent. A cesspit serving a monastery, a large inn, or a public facility might be enormous, 10, 12, 15 feet deep, several feet wide, of uncertain structural integrity, and filled to a depth that suggested it hadn't been seriously attended to in a very long time. Approaching one of these larger pits required experience and judgment. The gases that accumulated in deep cesspits included methane and hydrogen sulfide, both of which are dangerous in confined spaces. And there are records, including a particularly grim account from London, that we'll revisit in a later section of gong farmers, who were overcome by fumes while working in or near deep pits. The physical danger was real, acknowledged in the trade, and managed with a set of practical precautions that show up in descriptions of the work: the importance of ventilating a pit before entering, of never working alone, of keeping a lantern at a careful distance from certain types of gas accumulation. Whether these precautions were always followed, especially late in a long night's work when tiredness would have been considerable, is another question. You're standing at the end of the lane, and the lantern at the far building has been joined by a second light. Someone has come outside, and you can hear the low sound of conversation, the clink of metal on stone, the slow, deliberate sounds of a nighttime work crew preparing for its shift. There's nothing hurried about it. This is people doing a job they have done many times in the dark, with the quiet competence of the experienced. One of them glances in your direction, and there is a pause. Then the conversation resumes. You are clearly not the strangest thing this lane has seen tonight, and given what those men are about to spend the next several hours doing, that is probably the most charitable assessment possible. The city breathes around you slowly in the dark, and somewhere nearby a cesspit is waiting. You back away from the lane quietly, which feels like the respectful thing to do and also the self-preserving thing, and you find yourself on a slightly wider street, heading toward what appears to be a more central part of town. The sounds change as you walk. More voices, the distant clatter of something metallic, the low moan of an animal that is definitely not a dog. You round a corner and stop. There are pigs everywhere. Not in a pen, not behind a fence, just everywhere. Several of them are rooting through a pile of something against the base of a building, their snouts working with focused processional efficiency. 2 more are asleep in the middle of the street, apparently having decided that this particular patch of ground is theirs now, and that any objections can be directed to whatever authority governs such matters, which, in this case, appears to be no one. A small black piglet is standing in a doorway looking at you with the calm, assessing gaze of someone who has never in their life doubted that they are exactly where they are supposed to be. You have arrived at one of the most fundamental and most persistently underappreciated facts about Madhyakaleen urban life. The city was full of animals, not countryside animals, not farm animals, at a safe rural distance animals, living in and among the human population at extremely close quarters, sharing streets and yards, and in some cases the ground floors of houses with the people who owned them, tolerated them, or had simply failed to remove them. Pigs were the most visible, the most numerous in many towns, and in a very direct sense, the most useful. Madhyakaleen urban households kept pigs because pigs were an extraordinarily efficient conversion mechanism. You fed them kitchen scraps, food waste, spoiled grain, and the general organic refuse that accumulated around any household, and they converted it into meat, fat, and leather. They were, in the language of modern systems thinking, a waste processing technology. A pig in a Madhyakaleen town was doing a job, and it was doing it continuously at no cost beyond whatever it found to eat in the immediate environment. The problem, and you are standing in the problem right now, was that pigs doing their waste processing job in an urban street produced their own waste, which they deposited wherever they happened to be standing at the relevant moment, which was everywhere, continuously, throughout the day. A single pig produces a remarkable quantity of waste relative to its size. A street with a dozen pigs produces a quantity of waste that accumulates faster than the ambient processes of drying and dispersal can handle, particularly in a narrow lane with limited sunlight and airflow. Multiply this across a Madhyakaleen town with hundreds or thousands of pigs. London at various points in the Madhyakaleen period had pigs numbering in the Madhyakaleen period, had pigs numbering in the Madhyakaleen period, had pigs numbering in the thousands within the city walls. And you begin to understand the arithmetic of the smell problem from the animal side. Pigs weren't alone. Horses were everywhere in any town of consequence because horses were the engine of Madhyakaleen transport and commerce. Every cart required a horse. Every messenger required a horse. Every wealthy resident who wished to move around with appropriate speed and status required a horse. Horses were kept in stables within the city walls, often in tight quarters, and they produced waste with the same tireless dedication as every other living creature. A single horse produces in the range of 40 to 50 pounds of manure per day. A stable with 10 horses produces per week the kind of figure that requires a dedicated removal operation just to keep the stable functional, let alone the surrounding street. And then there were the other animals, the ones that get less attention in the historical record, but were no less present in the sensory landscape of the Madhyakaleen street. Chickens scratched in every yard and many streets. Their droppings small and individually insignificant, but collectively considerable when multiplied across a whole town. Geese, which were kept for both eggs and meat, and are, as anyone who has spent time near them can confirm, extraordinarily willing to deposit waste anywhere and at any time without the slightest social embarrassment. Cattle were driven through city streets on their way to markets and slaughterhouses, leaving a trail that the word trail barely does justice to. Sheep, goats, the occasional donkey. In some coastal towns and port cities, the mix included birds drawn by the fish trade, adding their own contributions to the general texture of the street surface. The ground of a busy Madhyakaleen street was, in the most literal sense, a deep accumulation of animal and human waste mixed with straw, hay, ash, food scraps, and mud, compressed by foot and hoof and wheel into a surface that was organic in every sense of the word. It was alive with decomposition. It generated heat in places where the organic material was dense enough. It was, in the language of modern microbiology, an extraordinarily active biological system, though no one in the 14th century would have used that language or had that framework. What they did have was a practical awareness that the condition of the street surface was connected to the smell, the drainage, and the general livability of the town, and various attempts were made to manage it. Straw was spread on badly degraded sections of street. Gravel was occasionally laid on particularly problematic surfaces in front of important buildings, churches, guild halls, the residences of wealthy merchants. The ground was sometimes more carefully swept and dressed with cleaner material, creating small islands of relative order in the general flow. The question of who was responsible for the street in front of a property was one that generated a remarkable amount of legal and civic discussion in Madhyakaleen towns. In many places, the householder was technically responsible for maintaining the street frontage, keeping it passable, managing the waste that accumulated there, not adding to it unnecessarily. In practice, this responsibility was unevenly observed, frequently disputed, and enforced with the kind of enthusiasm that characterizes municipal regulations everywhere in every era, which is to say intermittently, arbitrarily, and usually only after something had gone badly wrong. Horses brought a specific secondary problem beyond their direct waste contribution. They brought the infrastructure of horse management into the urban environment. Stables required bedding straw, which became manure-soaked straw, which had to go somewhere. They required hay storage. They attracted the flies and rats that followed animal feed and waste wherever it existed. A large lavery stable in the middle of a residential district was a significant node of sensory experience in every direction. And the people who lived near them knew it, resented it, and occasionally took legal action about it, with mixed results. Madhya-Kaleen municipalities did attempt at various points, and with varying degrees of seriousness, to regulate the presence of animals in streets. There are records from London, Paris, and various other cities of orders prohibiting pigs from roaming freely in certain districts, or requiring that livestock be kept penned rather than allowed to wander. Some of these orders were issued multiple times across decades, which tells you something useful about how effective they were. The pig problem in London specifically generated municipal attention repeatedly throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, with edicts, fines, and, in at least one famous case, the involvement of the city authorities in a dispute about whose pigs had damaged whose property and whose street. Scholars still debate whether these regulatory attempts represent a genuine shift in urban attitudes toward animal presence, an early, halting move toward the idea that cities should be organized differently from rural settlements, or whether they were simply reactive measures, prompted by specific crises or complaints with no underlying program of change behind them. The evidence points in both directions, and probably the answer is that it was different in different places and at different times, which is the kind of answer that is true and also slightly unsatisfying. What is not in dispute is the smell. The smell of a Madhya-Kaleen street was, in very large part, the smell of animals, their waste, their bodies, their feed, and the biological processes that connected all of those things to the ground beneath your feet and the air in your lungs. The piglet in the doorway has been joined by a slightly larger pig, and together they are investigating something at the base of the doorstep with the unhurried thoroughness of professionals. You step around them. They do not look up. The street ahead widens slightly, and in the gathering dark, you can hear something, a rush and bubble of moving water. For a moment, your heart lifts slightly. Water moving, water clean, perhaps cool, certainly. You are about to be disappointed. The sound of water grows clearer as you walk, and there's something instinctively comforting about it. The human nervous system responds to the sound of moving water with a kind of ancient cellular relief, a loosening of something held tight. You follow the sound around a bend in the street, and there it is, a river. Or rather, a waterway broader than a stream, narrower than what you might call a proper river, running along the edge of this part of town in a channel that is partially natural and partially shaped by generations of human hands building walls, bridges, and drainage channels that direct its flow through and past the city. You stand on a low bridge and look down. The water is not what you hoped. It is dark, for one thing. Not the clear darkness of deep, clean water, but a murky, opaque darkness that suggests content rather than depth. It moves, but slowly, with a heaviness that clean water doesn't have. Along the edges, where the current slows further, there are accumulations. You won't be more specific than that. And the smell rising from the surface is something you recognize from the last hour of your walk, concentrated and intensified, and given a new dimension by the addition of whatever biological processes are happening below that dark surface. There is a dead cat near the far bank, rotating slowly in a small eddy with the calm dignity of something that has entirely transcended its circumstances. This is the river, and the river in a Madhya-Kaleen town was not yo, or friend. This seems counterintuitive, because rivers were why Madhya-Kaleen towns existed where they existed. Water was essential for drinking, cooking, washing, industry, transport, and defense. A river was not just useful, but foundational, the reason a settlement had grown here rather than somewhere else. The river was infrastructure, resource, and lifeline all at once. And it was also, simultaneously and increasingly as towns grew, a disposal system for everything the town produced and no longer wanted. The logic was straightforward, even if the consequences were not. Water moves. Things put into moving water are carried away. The river takes your waste downstream, away from you, out of your immediate environment. This is true. One of the problems is that downstream is where someone else is, and what the river carries away from you, it carries toward them. And the other problem is that rivers in and around Madhyakaleen towns did not simply carry waste away cleanly. They received so much waste from so many sources that they became saturated with it, transformed by it, turned into something that was no longer functionally water in any useful sense, but rather a slow-moving concentrate of everything the city wanted to be rid of. The sources of contamination were numerous and continuous. Household waste went into the river directly, thrown from banks and bridges, or indirectly through drainage channels that carried the runoff of streets and yards into the waterway. Cesspits near the riverbank, and there were always cesspits near the riverbank, because proximity to water made disposal easier. Leached their contents into the surrounding soil and from there into the water table and the river itself. Laundry was done at the river's edge, and the water used for washing, grey with soap and human soil, ran back into the current. Industries clustered near rivers because they needed water, and having taken the water they needed, they returned it changed. Dyers poured their chai, chemical waste, into the river and colored it in shades that varied by season and by what was fashionable that year, so that a river running through a Vostra town might be red or blue or a particularly uninviting yellow depending on what colors were being produced. Upstream, butchers, as you will discover very soon, used rivers as a convenient channel for blood and offal. Tanners, and we will spend a great deal of time with the tanners, because they deserve their own extended discussion, produced effluent that was among the most chemically complex and biologically active of any Madhyakaleen industry, and all of it went into the nearest waterway. The Thames in London is perhaps the most documented example, but it was not exceptional. It was representative. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the Thames within the city was receiving waste from hundreds of thousands of people, dozens of major industries, the runoff of countless streets and yards, the drainage of countless cesspits, direct contributions of the slaughterhouses, tanneries, dye works, and fish markets that lined its banks. It was, by any modern measure, severely contaminated. Fish populations within the city stretch were significantly reduced compared to upstream reaches. The smell on hot summer days was described in contemporary records in terms that leave little to the imagination, and yet people drank from it. This is the thing that stops modern readers cold: the knowledge that the same water people were dumping waste into was the water they were drinking. How is this possible? How did people survive it? The answer is complicated and involves several factors that operated simultaneously. First, people drew water from the river at specific points, often upstream of the worst contamination, or from tributaries that were cleaner than the main channel, or from conduits that brought water from sources outside the city. Wealthier households had access to better water through private arrangements or public systems that predated the worst of the contamination. Second, a great deal of the liquid that Madhyakaleen people consumed was not water but ale, cider, or wine beverages, whose production involved fermentation processes that killed many of the pathogens that made raw water dangerous. Madhyakaleen ale was weak by modern standards, but it was safer than river water, and people drank it at all meals, including breakfast, including for children. Third, and this is where it gets interesting, the human gut. Exposed from infancy to a microbial environment that we would consider extremely challenging, developed tolerances and defenses that a modern person dropped into the same situation would not have. Madhyakaleen people were not drinking clean water and being mysteriously fine. They were getting sick constantly, dying young from waterborne illness at rates that we would consider catastrophic, building immunities that were hard-won and partial and that still failed frequently. The survival of Madhyakaleen urban populations in the face of their water supply is not evidence that the water was fine. It is evidence that human beings can adapt to extraordinary circumstances while still paying a very high price for them. Scholars still debate whether Madhyakaleen authorities understood the connection between water contamination and illness in any systematic way, or whether their responses to outbreaks were based on different frameworks. Miasma theory divine punishment, astrological influence that led them to interventions that sometimes helped and sometimes did not. What the records do show is that complaints about contaminated water were common, that specific polluters were sometimes identified and penalized, and that there was a persistent practical awareness that some water sources were better than others, even if the reasons were not fully understood. In Paris, an attempt was made in the 13th century to establish dedicated water conduits that would bring cleaner water from outside the Savoy. Artifact is within it an early piece of water infrastructure that acknowledged, at least implicitly, that the Seine was not an adequate drinking water source for a major city. Similar efforts appeared in other large cities with varying degrees of success and longevity. But for most people in most Modiglian towns, the river was what it was, both resource and sewer, both lifeline and hazard. Used for everything because it was there and because the alternatives were worse or unavailable. You lean on the bridge railing and look downstream. The dark water moves past you with its cargo of shadows and debris. Somewhere farther along the bank, a light is burning. A large light, several lights. And the smell coming from that direction is something new. Something that adds a specifically animal warmth to the chemical sharpness of the river. Something that suggests large quantities of blood. You are, without having planned it, approaching the butcher's quarter, and the river you are about to discover runs red down here after a busy day. You follow the lights along the river bank, and with each step, the smell intensifies. Not the general layered smell of the street you've been navigating for the past hour, but something more specific, more immediate, more viscerally animal. It is warm and metallic and sweet in a way that is entirely distinct from anything pleasant, and it coats the back of your throat in a way that makes you acutely aware that you have a throat. The ground here is darker than elsewhere, stained in a way that the low light makes ambiguous, but that you have a fairly confident theory about. The flies, even at this evening hour, are present in a way that suggests this is not unusual for this particular stretch of riverbank. You have arrived in the shambles. The word shambles, which in modern English has come to mean a state of complete disorder and confusion, derives directly from the Modiglian term for a slaughterhouse or meat market. Specifically, it comes from Rome, the Old English simul, meaning a bench or stall, and it referred to the wooden tables on which butchers displayed and processed meat. When people today say something is a complete shambles, they are, without knowing it, reaching back to one of the most odoriferously intense commercial districts in the pre-modern city. The etymology is a history lesson compressed into a single word. The shambles district existed in virtually every Modiglian town of any size, and its location was not random. Butchers needed water, large quantities of it for washing carcasses, for cleaning equipment, for the general management of blood and fluid that their work produced continuously throughout the working day. So they clustered near rivers and streams, and the rivers and streams near butchers' districts received in return for this proximity everything that the butchers did not need to keep, which was a great deal. The process of Modiglian meat production happened in public, or nearly so. Animals were driven into the district alive, cattle, pigs, sheep, poultry, and slaughtered on site, often in the street or in open yards that gave directly onto the street. The killing, the skinning, the gutting, the jointing, all of it happened in spaces that were not enclosed or sanitized in any modern sense. In proximity to the customers who came to buy the resulting product, in proximity to the river that received the waste, in proximity to the other traders and residents whose misfortune it was to be located nearby. Blood was the most immediate product of this process, and in a busy shambles district on a market day, blood ran freely down the gutters, across the street surface, into the drainage channels that led to the river. Contemporary accounts from London's shambles in Newgate and from similar districts in other cities describe gutters running red, the ground so saturated with blood that it was effectively soft, flies in densities that made the air above the district visibly thick on warm day. This was not a failure of hygiene by the standards of the time. It was simply what meat production looked like when it happened at urban scale, without containment infrastructure. Offal was the second great product of the shambles, and it posed a more complex disposal problem than blood. Blood, being liquid, could be washed or could drain. Offal, the internal organs, the stomach contents, the intestines, the heads, the feet, the hides that weren't valuable enough for the tanner, the bones that had no immediate use were solid or semi-solid, and it accumulated. Butchers were supposed to dispose of it responsibly, and in every city there were rules about what could be thrown into the street, what had to be removed from the district, and where the various categories of waste could legally be deposited. In practice, the river received a great deal of it. The Thames, the Seine, the various waterways running through German, Italian, and Flemish cities, all of them received offal from the butchers' districts that lined their banks, and the smell of the river near a shambles district on a warm afternoon was, by multiple contemporary accounts, one of the most challenging sensory experiences available in an already challenging sensory environment. Fish that had survived the general contamination of the urban river did not tend to survive the immediate vicinity of an active slaughterhouse. Doubtful. The specific organization of the shambles district reflected both the practical requirements of the trade and the social dynamics of Madhyakaleen commerce. Butchers in most cities organized themselves into guilds which regulated entry to the trade, set standards for the quality and pricing of meat, and negotiated with municipal authorities over the conditions under which the trade could operate. The guild structure gave butchers collective political weight that helped them resist the most inconvenient regulatory impositions attempts to move the slaughterhouse district away from the city center, for instance, or to impose stricter controls on waste disposal, while also giving the authorities a single organized body to negotiate with when conditions became genuinely intolerable. Because conditions did sometimes become genuinely intolerable, even by the standards of people who lived in a Madhyakaleen city. The records of various European cities include complaints about the shambles that suggest a threshold was occasionally crossed, even for contemporary sensibilities. Complaints about the smell reaching into churches and civic buildings, about the ground being impassable after heavy slaughtering days, about specific incidents of waste being dumped in unauthorized locations and left there. In London, the Butchers' Guild was in periodic conflict with city authorities throughout the 13th and 14th centuries over waste disposal practices, and the records of these disputes give a vivid picture of what the district actually looked like at its worst. One particularly illuminating category of byproduct was stomach contents, the partially digested plant material found inside the stomachs of cattle and sheep at slaughter, which had its own specific smell and which presented a disposal challenge that butchers addressed with varying degrees of conscientiousness. Some of it was used. Pig stomach contents, in particular, had agricultural applications as a kind of predigested organic matter, but much of it simply ended up in the river or the street or wherever was most convenient at the end of a busy day, adding its own specific contribution to the ambient atmosphere of the district. Poultry added a different dimension to the shambles environment. Chicken and goose slaughter produced feathers in enormous quantities, feathers that got everywhere, that stuck to everything, that drifted on the air and settled on neighboring stalls and in the food of neighboring traders and in the hair and clothes of everyone in the hair. Feathers. Wet feathers have a smell that is specific and persistent, and that becomes, in large quantities and warm temperatures, something you do not forget. The feather problem was significant enough to appear in regulations in several cities, which attempted to specify where poultry could be processed and where the resulting feathers could be deposited. Scholars still debate whether the clustering of the butchery trade near rivers was a deliberate sanitary strategy, an early recognition that water could carry waste away, or simply a practical response to the need for large water supplies in the trade, with waste disposal being an incidental benefit. The distinction matters for understanding how Madhyakaleen people conceptualized the relationship between industry and environment. But the practical result was the same. Either way, the rivers near shambles districts were among the most heavily contaminated waterways in the Madhyakaleen city, and the people who lived and worked nearby experienced the consequences of that contamination in their daily water supply, their food, and the air they breathe. The lights along the bank are the lamps of the last traders closing up for the evening, rolling down their wooden shutters, washing their hands in the same river that has received the day's work, loading unsold cuts onto carts to be taken to wherever unsold cuts went at the end of a market day. The ground around the stalls glistens in the lamplight with moisture that is not water, and the flies are beginning to give way slightly to the cooler evening air. A cart rolls past you heavily, and from beneath its canvas cover something drips slowly and darkly onto the street as it goes. You watch it go. You do not follow it. Instead, you follow your nose, which, given everything you have experienced tonight, is a choice you are making with decreasing confidence toward a district that is slightly farther from the river, slightly uphill, where a different and in some ways more chemically complex smell has been threading through the general atmosphere since you arrived in this part of town. Something sharp and acrid and ancient, something that speaks of transformation, of raw things being changed into useful things by processes that are, to put it gently, not pleasant to be near. The tanners are ahead, and if the shambles tested your resolve, the tanneries are going to require something more like genuine commitment. You smell the tanneries before you see them, which is fitting, because in a Madhyakalin town, the tanneries announce themselves to every other sense long before your eyes were involved. The smell is different from what you've encountered so far tonight, different from the organic warmth of the shambles, different from the deep earthiness of the cesspit district, different from the general layered complexity of the street. This is something sharper, more chemical, more ancient in some way that is hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. It gets into the back of your sinuses and stays there. It has weight. It has texture. It is the smell of transformation, of animal skin being forcibly converted into leather through a series of processes that are, taken individually, each more unpleasant than the last, and taken together constitute what many historians of the Madhyakalin sensory environment have described with considerable understatement as one of the most challenging industrial smells in human history. Tanning is one of the oldest crafts in human civilization, and the basic chemistry of it has not changed as much as you might hope between the Madhyakalin period and the present day. The goal is to convert raw animal hide, which, left to itself, will simply rot, because it is organic matter, and organic matter decomposes into leather, which is stable, durable, flexible, and enormously useful. The transformation requires breaking down the structure of the hide at a molecular level and replacing the biological compounds that made it alive and perishable with compounds that are chemically stable and resistant to decay. This process in the Madhyakalin period was accomplished through a sequence of steps that each required specific ingredients, specific vessels, specific amounts of time, and specific quantities of passions from anyone within a significant radius. The first challenge was removing the hair from the hide. Raw hides came from the slaughterhouse with their hair intact, and the hair had to go before the tanning process could begin. The method used in most Madhyakalin tanneries involved soaking the hides in a solution of water and wood ash, an alkaline solution of the hair follicles made the hair easier to scrape away. This was done in large pits or vats, and the soaking hides, as they sat in their alkaline bath for days at a time, produced a smell that was the first of many distinct contributions the tannery made to the neighborhood atmosphere. But the ash solution was just the beginning. Before the actual tanning the leather-making step could take place, the hides needed to be thoroughly cleaned of all remaining biological material, fat, flesh, and a substance called the grain, which is the outermost layer of the skin. This cleaning was done mechanically by hand, with scraping tools, in a process that required skill and physical labor, and that produced as its byproduct quantities of biological material that needed to go somewhere. It was in the preparation stages that the tannery's most infamous ingredient made its appearance: urine. Specifically, large quantities of collected human urine used as a soaking solution for hides in the early stages of preparation. Urine is alkaline. It is available in consistent quantities in any populated area. It is free, and it works. It softens hide fiber and assists in the removal of unwanted material in ways that were understood empirically long before anyone had the chemistry to explain why. Madhyakalin tanneries collected urine from the surrounding community in large barrels, sometimes paying a small sum for it, sometimes simply maintaining collection points that local residents used as a matter of course. The foots of aging urine that sat in tannery yards, some of them weeks or months old, concentrated by evaporation, enriched by decomposition, were a sensory experience of a very specific kind. Combined with the decomposing biological material from the hides and the alkaline smell of the ash solution, the tannery yard in its preparatory stages offered a combination of smells that contemporary accounts struggled to describe adequately, partly because the vocabulary for industrial chemical smells was not well developed, and partly because some experiences resist description in any vocabulary. Then came the tanning itself, the step that gives the craft its name. Traditional vegetable tanning used tannin, a naturally occurring compound found in tree bark, particularly oak bark. Ground bark was mixed with water in large stone or wooden pits, and the prepared hides were layered into these pits and left to soak for extended periods, weeks for lighter leathers, months or even years for the heaviest grades of sole leather. The hides were moved through a sequence from weaker to stronger tannin solutions as the leather gradually developed. During this process, the pits of bark, hide, and water fermented slowly, generating their own biological activity and their own range of smells that added to the tannery's total atmospheric output. The proximity of tanneries to rivers was, like the shambles, both practical and consequential. The tanning process required enormous quantities of water at every stage for soaking, for rinsing, for mixing solutions, for the final washing of finished leather, and everything the tannery used once went back into the waterway. The alkaline runoff from the ash pits, the urine solutions, the biological waste from hide preparation, the spent tannin solutions from the bark pits, dark brown and chemically active. A river running past an active tannery district received all of this continuously, and the effect on the waterway downstream was significant enough to be noted in contemporary records in terms of both smell and color. The location of tanneries within or near Madhikaline towns was a source of persistent conflict, and the records of this conflict are among the most vivid documents available for understanding how Madhikaline urban residents experienced industrial pollution. Tanners needed to be near their raw material, the slaughterhouse, and near water, but the neighbors of tanneries were consistently and loudly unhappy about it. Complaints about tanneries appear in municipal records across Europe throughout the Madhikaline period, and the responses of city authorities reveal the fundamental tension between economic necessity and residential quality of life that characterizes urban planning disputes in every era. In London, tanners were repeatedly ordered to move their operations outside the city walls, or at least away from residential districts, with limited success. In Paris, the tanning industry was pushed progressively to the edges of the city over the course of the Madhikaline period. Though it never disappeared entirely from within the urban area, in smaller towns where the political weight of the Tanners Guild was more evenly matched against the complaints of residents, the disputes could drag on for decades without resolution. Scholars still debate whether the periodic attempts to relocate tanneries represent a genuine emerging concept of zoning, the idea that incompatible land uses should be spatially separated, or whether they were simply reactive responses to specific crises without any underlying urban planning philosophy. The evidence suggests both were true in different places, and that the concept of separating noxious industries from residential areas was developing slowly and unevenly across the Madhikaline period, driven more by accumulated complaint than by systematic thinking. Dog dung deserves a mention here, because it was specifically valuable to the tanning industry in a way that created one of the Madhikaline city's more unusual informal economies. Certain stages of leather preparation benefited from treatment with a substance called pure or pure. Which was, in plain terms, dog feces collected from the streets and sold to tanneries, where it was used as a soaking solution for specific types of leather, particularly fine glove leather. The alkaline and enzymatic properties of dog feces made it effective for softening certain hides to the required degree of suppleness, and the demand for it was consistent enough to support a class of urban workers, sometimes called pure finders, who made their living collecting it from the streets and selling it by the bucket to tanneries. The pure finders were, in the social geography of Madhikaline urban labor, in a category adjacent to the gong farmers, essential, invisible, working with materials that everyone else preferred not to think about. earning a living from the gap between what the city produced and what the city was willing to manage itself. Their existence is a small but telling detail about the economy of the Madhikaleen street. Almost nothing that accumulated at ground level was without value to someone if you were willing to do the collecting. The tannery lights ahead are burning late. Tanning is patient work, and the pits require attention at all hours. You can see figures moving in the flickering light, men working with long poles to shift the hides in their soaking vuts, their silhouettes unhurried against the glow. The smell wraps around you completely now, and something in your sensory processing has begun to do the thing that sensory processing does when overwhelmed, a kind of soft withdrawal, a stepping back from full engagement with the input. That is the body's way of saying it has received the message and would prefer now to receive slightly less of it. This is called olfactory fatigue, and it is something we will return to later tonight, because it turns out to be one of the most important tools in the Madhikaleen urban residents' entirely involuntary survival kit. For now, you turn away from the tannery lights and back toward the quieter streets where the true smell is merely the general smell of the city rather than the concentrated output of a specific industry. The air, by comparison, feels almost clean. Your nose, which is recalibrated somewhat, accepts this relative improvement with something that might be described as gratitude. Somewhere ahead, there is the smell of wood smoke and something baking. It is warm and round and almost good. Almost. The smell of baking bread is one of the most universally comforting smells available to the human nose. Something deep in the architecture of human experience responds to it, with an almost reflexive relaxation, a loosening of shoulders, a slowing of breath. It speaks of warmth and nourishment and the particular safety of being inside rather than outside, of having enough rather than not enough. Even here, in this city that has spent the last several hours systematically challenging every assumption you brought with you about what air is supposed to smell like, the smell of bread baking cuts through of everything else and lands somewhere warm and reassuring in the back of your mind. You follow it. The communal oven, the bakehouse. The common oven, the fournil in French towns, the backhouse in German ones, was one of the central institutions of Madhikaleen urban life, and its importance went well beyond the simple production of bread. In a city of timber-framed buildings packed closely together, the risk of fire was existential and constant, and one of the most effective ways to reduce that risk was to concentrate the production of high-heat cooking in dedicated, purpose-built facilities rather than having every household maintain its own large fire. The communal oven served this function. It was a fireproofing strategy as much as a cooking facility, a piece of urban infrastructure designed to reduce the chance that one household's dinner preparations would result in the destruction of an entire neighborhood. The baker, who ran the communal oven, was therefore a figure of considerable practical importance in the neighborhood. People brought their unbaked loaves, and sometimes their pies, their pastries, their roasting joints to the bakehouse to be cooked, paying a small fee for the use of the oven's heat, and the baker managed the fire, the timing, and the general organization of what was, on busy days, a complicated flow of different households' food moving through a single facility. It required skill, reliability, and a certain social authority. The baker knew everyone's business in a neighborhood in the most literal sense, because everyone's food passed through their hands. The smell of the bakehouse from the outside was genuinely good. The yeast, the crust, the caramelizing sugars of bread in a hot oven, and you can understand why you followed it across the city. But as you get closer, and as the warm air from the oven's ventilation begins to carry more information, you notice that the smell is not entirely the clean, simple smell of bread. There is something underneath it. Something that the bread smell almost, but not quite, covers. The fuel that heated Madhikaleen communal ovens was not always or even primarily clean firewood. Wood was expensive, particularly in densely populated towns where the surrounding forests had been significantly reduced by generations of demand for building material. And fuel, what bakers used instead or in addition to wood, was whatever burned and was available and was cheap. This included peat, which was available in some regions and burned with a dense, heavy smoke. It included charcoal, which was cleaner than wood but required its own production infrastructure, and it very commonly included a fuel source that was, in the context of everything you've learned tonight, entirely logical, but that the warm bread smell part of your brain was hoping not to encounter dried animal dung. Dried dung, primarily dried horse or cattle dung, sometimes mixed with straw, was a standard fuel in many parts of Madhyakaline Europe. Use, not just in baking, but in domestic heating and various industrial processes. It burned slowly, held heat well, and was available in quantities that required no forest and no production process beyond collection and drying. In towns where horse traffic was heavy, the supply was essentially unlimited. The economic logic was impeccable. The effect on the flavor and smell of what was baked above it was, depending on your perspective, either negligible or significant. Contemporary sources are not entirely silent on this question. There are references in various Madhyakaline texts to the quality of bread being affected by the fuel used to a smokiness, a particular heaviness in bread baked over certain fuels that discerning customers noticed, and that bakers with reputations to maintain tried to manage. Whether the average urban resident in the 14th century cared particularly about the fuel their bread was baked over, given everything else they were managing, is a question that the historical record does not answer with great clarity. Probably many of them did not, in the same way that people adapt to the conditions of their environment and cease to notice things that are simply normal. The keeping of dough was another dimension of the bakehouse smell that bears some attention. Bread requires leavening, a process by which yeast produces carbon dioxide that makes the dough rise and gives the finished bread its texture. In the Madhyakaline period, before commercial yeast was available, bakers maintained their leavening through a sourdough-style process, keeping a portion of each day's dough to leaven the next day's batch. Feeding and maintaining the starter as a living culture that could be years or even decades old in an established bakery. A healthy, well-maintained bread starter smells pleasantly sour, smensly yeasty, alive in a way that is specific and recognizable. But a starter that is not perfectly maintained, or that is kept in conditions that are warmer or more contaminated than ideal, can develop additional microbial populations that shift its smell in less pleasant directions. The warm, slightly closed conditions of a Madhyakaline bakehouse, combined with the general microbial richness of the urban environment, meant that many bakers' starters were complex microbial communities indeed, producing bread that was leavened and edible, but that carried in its flavor and smell the signature of the environment in which it was made. Scholars still debate whether Madhyakaline bread, by the standards of modern food science, would be considered safe for consumption, whether the various organisms present in the dough and contributed by the baking environment would represent a health risk, or whether the heat of baking would reliably neutralize them. The general consensus is that baking temperatures were sufficient to kill most harmful organisms, and that the sourdough fermentation process itself produced acids that inhibited pathogen growth. The Madhyakaline digestive system, like the Madhyakaline nose, had calibrated itself to its environment. The social institution of the communal bakehouse generated its own conflicts and anxieties, and the Madhyakaline baker occupies a somewhat ambiguous position in the historical record as a figure who was essentially trusted with everyone's food, but also routinely suspected of dishonesty. The most common accusation was short waiting, giving customers less bread than they had paid for, either by keeping a portion of the dough or by other means. This concern was serious enough that many cities introduced the assize of bread, a regulatory system that set the weight and price of bread according to the price of grain and imposed penalties on bakers who did not comply. The penalties for dishonest baking in Madhyakaline England were, by modern standards, theatrical. A baker convicted of consistently short waiting was subject to being drawn through the streets on a hurdle, a kind of wooden sled with the offending loaf tied around the neck, so that the entire neighborhood could observe both the crime and its punishment. This was humiliating, public, and effective as a deterrent in ways that a fine might not have been, because the social cost of public shame in a small, face-to-face community was real and lasting. You have reached the bakehouse, and the door is slightly open. The evening's baking is finishing up, the last loaves coming out, the fire being banked for the night. The warm air coming through the door carries the yeast and the crust, and underneath it the heavy, smoky undertone of the fuel and the ancient sourness of the starter, and something else, something you decide, is probably just the general warmth of a room that has been very hot for many hours and has absorbed in its walls and floor the history of many years of baking. A cat sits in the warm doorway, its eyes half closed, radiating contentment in a way that suggests it has found the single best spot available in this entire city on this particular evening. You consider its judgment. It has been in this city considerably longer than you have, and it looks entirely at peace. The bread, when the baker sets a small piece on the sill to cool, smells wonderful. In spite of everything, it smells wonderful. You find, to your surprise, that you are hungry. You do not eat the bread, not because it wouldn't taste good. The cat's verdict on the doorway situation has actually made you more confident about the immediate neighborhood than you have felt all evening. But because eating requires hands, and your hands have been in the vicinity of this city's streets for several hours now, and some instincts survive even the most thorough historical immersion, you back away from the bakehouse with something that might be described as respectful restraint, and you find a slightly wider street where the evening air moves with something approaching freshness, and you stand there for a moment and simply breathe, and that's when you notice something on the person walking past you. They are well-dressed, not nobility, but comfortable. The clothes of a prosperous merchant or a senior guild member. Good wool, a decent cut. The kind of outfit that signals in this world that you have enough, and then some. They are walking with purpose, head slightly down, and in their hand they are holding something small and round, something that catches the lamplight with a dull gleam of metal. And as they pass you, a smell comes with them that is entirely unlike anything else you've encountered tonight. It is good genuinely, unambiguously good, something floral and resinous and warm. Something that contains what might be cloves or ambergris or dried roses or all of these things together. A small sphere of concentrated pleasantness moving through the general atmosphere of the city, like a rumor of somewhere better. The merchant passes, and the smell fades, and you are left standing in the street with the sudden vivid understanding of what that object was. And what it was for. It was a pomander. And it was not an accessory. It was survival equipment. The pomander, from the French pommard d'ambre, meaning apple of amber, was a small container, typically made of metal and pierced with holes, filled with aromatic substances. Ambergris, musk, civet, dried herbs, spices, resins, flowers, any combination of intensely fragrant materials that could be packed into a small space and carried close to the nose. Wealthy individuals carried them on chains or ribbons, held them in their hands in crowded places, tucked them into clothing when moving through parts of the city that were particularly challenging. They ranged from simple functional objects, a bowl of herbs wrapped in cloth, to elaborately crafted pieces of goldsmithing with hinged sections, decorative piercing, and compartments for different aromatic mixtures. The pomander represented, in physical form, the Modigliani theory of smell and health that dominated medical thinking throughout this period. That theory, rooted in ancient Greek medicine and transmitted through Islamic scholarship into European practice, held that disease was spread through bad air, miasma. The word comes from the Greek for pollution or defilement. The miasma theory proposed that the corrupt, foul-smelling air that arose from rotting organic matter, stagnant water, and disturbed soil was itself the vehicle of illness, that breathing bad air directly caused the diseases associated with it. From plague to fever, to the general category of illness that Modigliani physicians called pestilence. This theory was wrong in the specific mechanistic sense. Smell itself does not transmit disease. The actual mechanisms, bacteria, viruses, contaminated water, infected vectors, were not understood and would not be for several centuries. But the miasma theory was wrong in an interesting way, because it correctly identified the correlation between foul-smelling environments and high disease rates, even if it missed the cause. Modigliani people who avoided cesspit districts, stagnant waterways, and rotting organic accumulations were in fact reducing their exposure to disease, not because the smell was the problem, but because the conditions that produced the smell were the same conditions that harbored the pathogens, the contaminated water, and the disease vectors that actually caused illness. The practical result of miasma theory was a set of protective behaviors that were partially effective for reasons their practitioners did not fully understand. Carrying aromatic substances near the nose filtered and masked the smell of bad air. It didn't filter pathogens, but it reduced the time spent breathing deeply in contaminated environments, and it may have had some minor antimicrobial effect in cases where the aromatic substances used had genuine antibacterial properties. Some of them did. More importantly, it prompted people to take the quality of air seriously, to seek out better air, to be aware of their environment in ways that had downstream effects on their choices about where to live and how to move through the city. Strewing of herbs on floors was another expression of the same logic, and it was a practice that extended well beyond the households of the wealthy. Russia's dried marsh plants were commonly spread on the floors of domestic interiors throughout the Madhyakaline period, serving multiple functions simultaneously. They provided insulation, they cushioned hard stone or earth floors, they absorbed spills and tracked in mud, and they were aromatic, releasing a pleasant green smell when walked on that helped manage the indoor air quality of spaces that had limited ventilation and that housed, in addition to their human residents, the smells of cooking, wet clothing, animals, and the accumulated organic debris of daily life. The herbs, mixed into or strewn alongside the rushes, were chosen with some care: lavender, rosemary, mint, wormwood, meadowsweet, tansy, and various others that combined pleasant smell with what were understood to be protective properties. Some of these choices were well-founded. Lavender and rosemary have genuine antimicrobial properties, and wormwood is an effective insect repellent which mattered in domestic spaces where fleas and lice were constant presences. The Madhyakaline housewife choosing her floor herbs was operating within a framework that mixed empirical observation, traditional knowledge, and theoretical understanding in the way that practical knowledge usually does. Not entirely right, not entirely wrong, doing real work in the world. The expense of aromatic materials varied enormously and tracked closely with the social geography of smell. At the top of the social hierarchy, the aromatic toolkit was extensive and costly. Ambergris, a waxy substance produced in the digestive tract of sperm whales and found floating at sea or washed onto beaches, was extraordinarily expensive, prized for its ability to fix other scents and carry them longer. Musk, derived from the musk deer, was similarly costly. Civet, produced by the civet cat, was another fixative of great value. These substances were traded across enormous distances, moving from the Indian Ocean and East Asian trade routes through the Levant and into European markets, their price reflecting every hand they had passed through. For less wealthy households, the aromatic toolkit was simpler, but not absent. Dried lavender, rosemary, and mint could be grown in a garden or purchased cheaply at market. Juniper branches were burned as a fumigant in sick rooms and spaces where disease had been present. Vinegar, cheap, widely available, genuinely antimicrobial, was used to wash surfaces and sometimes held to the nose in contaminated environments. The principle of using smell as a protective and therapeutic tool was not confined to the wealthy. It was widespread, accessible at different price points, and woven into the practical domestic knowledge of every household. The church added its own layer of aromatic management to the urban sensory landscape. Incense, frankincense, myrrh, and various other resins burned continuously in churches and cathedrals, serving theological purposes that we will examine more closely in a later section, but also functioning practically as a powerful fumigant and air modifier in spaces that were used by large numbers of people. A Madhyakaline church on a busy Sunday, with its stone walls and its congregation of people who had walked through the streets to get there, was an interesting olfactory environment. The accumulated smell of the congregation meeting, the incense smoke in a space designed to concentrate sound, and it turned out, smell. Scholars still argue whether the Madhyakaline use of aromatic substances represents a coherent proto-scientific approach to public health, an empirically grounded, if theoretically wrong, system, or whether it is better understood primarily as a cultural and social practice in which the use and display of aromatic substances communicated status, piety, and sophistication independently of any health function. Almost certainly it was both, inseparably. And the attempt to separate the practical from the symbolic in Madhyakaline material culture is generally a losing exercise. The merchant with the pomander has long since disappeared around a corner, leaving only the memory of that brief passing fragrance. You are standing in the street, and the night air is doing what night air does, settling, cooling, concentrating, and the city's bass note is reasserting itself around you with the patient confidence of something that has been here much longer than you have, and will be here long after you are gone. But for a moment, just for a moment, the smell of cloves and ambergris and dried roses is still there, faintly at the edge of perception. A small, deliberate act of beauty in a world that had very limited options for creating it. You breathe it in while you can. The night is fully settled now, and the city has shifted into its after-dark rhythm. Quieter than the day, but not silent. Never silent. Somewhere behind you, the gong farmers are at work. Somewhere ahead, a tavern is open and loud. The streets are not empty, but they are thinning. And the people still moving through them are moving with purpose, heads down. Familiar with the geography in a way that allows them to navigate without much thought. You have been walking for hours, and you have learned to read the ground with your feet, to feel the difference between packed earth and something less definitive, to step without looking in ways that a few hours ago would have seemed unthinkable. You have adapted partially, temporarily, which is, as it happens, exactly what tonight's next subject is about. But before we get to adaptation, we need to talk about disaster. Because the cesspits and the dung hills and the rivers and the tannery pits, all of the slow, ambient, continuous sources of smell and contamination that you have been navigating were the normal condition of the Madhyakaleen city. They were the background. And sometimes the background gave way to something acute and specific and catastrophic. And those events left marks in the historical record vivid enough that they have survived 700 years and still managed to be both horrible and, in the way that true disasters usually are, faintly, uncomfortably funny. The great cesspit disasters of the Madhyakaleen period are a category of event that historians of everyday life have documented with what can only be described as loving attention, because they represent the points at which the infrastructure of the Madhyakaleen city, such as it was, failed in ways that were impossible to ignore, impossible to minimize, and impossible in retrospect to discuss without a complicated mixture of sympathy and involuntary amusement. The most famous, and in many ways the most perfectly constructed of these events occurred in the German town of Erfurt in 1184. It was not, strictly speaking, a Madhyakaleen English event, but it belongs to the broader story of Madhyakaleen urban infrastructure failure so completely that it demands inclusion. And besides, it happened in a place and at a moment that give it a quality of historical irony that is genuinely extraordinary. In July of 1184, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa called an assembly of the German nobility at Erfurt, a gathering of the most powerful lords and ecclesiastical figures in the empire, convened to address a dispute between the Archbishop of Mainz and the Landgrave of Thuringia. This was, in other words, a high-level political event attended by royalty and senior clergy, held at a location chosen for its importance and prestige. The assembly met in the great hall of a building. Accounts differ on whether it was a palace or a church whose upper floor was the designated meeting room. The floor gave way. Not gradually, not with warning. The floor of the upper chamber collapsed. Send. The assembled nobility of the Holy Roman Empire, princes, bishops, counts, the most powerful people on the continent, through the floor and into the room below, which was not, unfortunately, an empty room. It was a cesspit. The building had been constructed above a large cesspit, and the weight of the assembled nobility, combined with whatever structural weaknesses had developed in the floor, was sufficient to complete the failure at the worst possible moment. Multiple accounts of the event survive, and they agree on the essential details. A number of people died drowned or crushed in the collapse and its immediate aftermath. The number varies by source. Some accounts say 6. Some say more. And the specific identities of the dead are recorded in several chronicles with the careful specificity of people documenting a major historical event, because it was a major historical event. The Erfurt latrine disaster, as it is known to historians, disrupted imperial politics, traumatized the nobility of the empire, and generated a paper trail of shocked chronicle entries that makes it one of the best documented sanitation disasters in Madhyakaleen history. Scholars still debate whether the Erfurt collapse was the result of structural negligence, a flaw that was known to be inadequate and was used anyway, or whether it was a genuine surprise failure of what was considered sound construction. The political dimensions of the disaster, the fact that it happened at a moment of high political tension, have led some historians to speculate about whether the structural failure might have been encouraged. But the evidence for deliberate sabotage is not strong, and most historians treat it as a catastrophic accident. What the Erfurt disaster illustrates with terrible vividness is the proximity of the cesspit to every level of Madhyakaleen life. Even the most powerful, even in their most formal and ceremonially significant moments, were separated from the infrastructure of waste by a single flaw. And when that flaw was insufficient, the infrastructure asserted itself with complete democratic indifference to the social status of whoever happened to be standing on it. Less dramatic, but more numerous were the everyday cesspit failures that affected ordinary urban residents, the overflows, the collapses, the seepages that contaminated neighboring properties and generated the kinds of neighbor disputes that ended up in municipal courts. The records of London's civic courts in the 13th and 14th centuries contain a remarkable number of cases involving cesspits neighbors suing each other over cesspits that had been built too close to shared walls, cesspits that had been allowed to overflow into adjacent properties, cesspits that had leaked into cellars and ruined stored goods. One London case from the early 14th century involves a man named William Spratt, whose cesspit had apparently been seeping through a shared wall into the cellar of his neighbor, William de Betone, for some time before the matter reached the courts. The description of the resulting condition of Betone's cellar is detailed, specific, and vivid in ways that leave nothing to the imagination. The court found in favor of Betone and ordered Spratt to repair the cesspit at his own expense, a resolution that seems both just and, given the time elapsed before the matter was addressed, perhaps slightly tardy. The risk of falling into a cesspit was real enough to appear in coroner's records, the Madhyakaleen equivalent of death certificates, as a cause of death. These are not common entries, but they exist, and they describe accidents that happened in the dark, on narrow paths near cesspit openings, to people whose nighttime navigation of the city went wrong in the most irreversible way possible. The gong farmers working at night around open pits were particularly vulnerable, and the precautions they took, never working alone, always maintaining awareness of the pit's edge, reflect a professional knowledge of a specific and fatal occupational hazard. There is also the matter of gases. Cesspits, particularly large and deep ones, accumulated methane and hydrogen sulfide as the organic material within them decomposed. Both gases are dangerous in confined spaces. Methane is flammable and explosive. Hydrogen sulfide is toxic at concentrations that can be reached in a deep pit without adequate ventilation. Records of gong farmers being overcome by fumes are not common, but not absent. And the professional practice of ventilating a pit before beginning work was a practical response to a real and understood danger. The feast that ended badly category of event appears in several variations across Madhyakaleen sources and typically involves a celebratory gathering, usually indoors, over or near a structural element compromised by cesspit proximity or cesspit failure, with consequences that interrupted the celebration in the most effective way available. These stories circulated widely, were retold with the mixture of horror and dark humor that disasters usually generate, and served a practical social function. They reminded people that the infrastructure beneath their feet required attention, that neglect had consequences, and that the gap between a celebratory banquet and a catastrophic encounter with its own waste management was sometimes quite literally a single flaw. The city around you is quiet enough now that you can hear, if you listen carefully, the sounds of the night workers, the gong farmers, the night watchmen, the bakers starting their pre-dawn preparations, the various nocturnal operations that kept the city functional while its daytime inhabitants slept. It is a thin, specific kind of quiet, full of the small sounds of work continuing in the dark. You are standing near a building that has, you notice, a slightly uneven patch of ground in front of it, Ground that is darker than the surrounding surface, that gives slightly when you test it with your foot, that has a particular quality of moisture that is not rain. You step back onto firmer ground carefully, with the considered caution of someone who has tonight learned a great deal about what lies beneath the surface of things. You move away from the uneven ground with the careful deliberateness of someone who has recalibrated their relationship with the word solid, and you find a slightly more confident stretch of street leading toward the older part of town, where the buildings are larger and the lanes between them narrower, and the smell has a different character, less animal, more mineral. Something sharp and medicinal underneath the general ambient note of the city. There is lamplight in a window above you, and the shadow of someone moving behind it, and the sound of liquid being poured into something ceramic. And then a smell that cuts through everything else, with the clean, iron-sharp authority of blood. Not butcher's blood, you have encountered that already, and this is different. This is the small, specific smell of blood in an enclosed space. Blood in measured quantities. Blood as instrument rather than byproduct. You are near a physician's establishment, or perhaps a barber surgeon's, and someone inside is either treating a patient or preparing to. And the work that Madhyakaleen medicine involved was, to put it with maximum diplomatic restraint, a sensory experience that deserves its own extended discussion. Madhyakaleen medicine smelled bad. This is not a controversial statement. It smelled bad in ways that were specific to the practices it involved, the materials it used, the theories it operated under, and the environments in which it was practiced. And the smell of Madhyakaleen medical treatment was, in many cases, an integral part of the treatment itself, not an incidental byproduct, but a deliberate element. Because the theoretical framework within which Madhyakaleen physicians operated told them that smell was causally connected to health and illness in that made the aromatic quality of a treatment directly relevant to its therapeutic effect. The foundation of Madhyakaleen medical theory was the system of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, inherited from ancient Greek medicine through the work of Galen and transmitted through Islamic medical scholarship into European practice. Health in this system was a state of proper balance among the 4 humors. Illness was an imbalance, too much of one humor, too little of another, the wrong humor dominant in the wrong season, or the wrong body type. Treatment was accordingly directed at restoring balance, removing excess humor or stimulating deficient ones through a range of interventions that followed logically from the theory even when they did not follow helpfully from the condition. Bloodletting was the most visible, most widely practiced, and most persistently used of these interventions. The logic was elegant within the framework. If a patient showed signs of excess blow, old fever, redness, inflammation, the appropriate treatment was to remove some blood, reducing the excess and restoring balance. The practice was applied to an enormous range of conditions by physicians, barber surgeons, and in monasteries by monks, following the regular schedule of bloodletting that many religious communities maintained as a preventive health measure. Removing blood prophylactically at regular intervals to prevent the accumulation of excess that might cause future illness. The instruments of bloodletting, the lancet, the phlegm, the bleeding bowl, were standard equipment in any medical establishment. And the blood they collected accumulated in the ceramic or wooden bowls that sat on the surgeon's workbench waiting for disposal. The disposal of bloodletting waste was one of the small, constant sources of organic material that contributed to the Madhyakaleen street's ambient composition, because the blood had to go somewhere. And somewhere in a Madhyakaleen city generally meant outs. A day into the street, into the drainage channel, into the general flow of organic matter that moved slowly toward the nearest waterway. Urine occupied a central and somewhat extraordinary position in Madhyakaleen diagnostic medicine, a position so central that the practice of uroscopy, the examination of urine as a diagnostic tool, became one of the most characteristic images of the Madhyakaleen physician. The urine flask, a round-bottomed glass vessel designed to hold and display a sample of urine for examination, was the symbol of the medical profession. In the same way that the stethoscope is today, appearing in portraits of physicians, on signs above apothecaries, in manuscript illustrations of medical practice throughout the period, the examination of urine was taken seriously as a diagnostic method. And within the framework of humoral medicine, it had a coherent rationale. Urine was understood as a product of the body's processing of its internal state, and its color, clarity, smell, consist, and various other properties were read as indicators of the humoral balance within. A skilled physician could, in theory, diagnose a patient's condition from their urine alone without examining the patient directly. And there are records of physicians being sent urine samples from distant patients for remote diagnosis, a kind of Madhyakaleen telemedicine, conducted through the medium of a glass flask and a courier. The smell of a physician's consulting room, therefore, included the smell of urine, multiple samples in various states of freshness from patients in various states of illness, alongside the smell of blood. From recent bleedings, the smell of the herbal preparations being compounded in the back room, and the general smell of a space where sick people came in large numbers. Madhyakaleen illness had its own smell, and anyone who has spent time in a pre-antibiotic medical environment would recognize it, the specific combination of fever, sweat, wound discharge. The altered body chemists. Try of serious illness, and the herbal and animal-derived preparations used to treat it. The pharmacopoeia of Madhyakaleen medicine was extensive, varied and aromatic in ways that ranged from the genuinely pleasant to the genuinely alarming. Herbal preparations, tinctures, plasters, inhalations, fumigants made up a large proportion of the Madhyakaleen physician's toolkit, and used materials whose smell was part of their understood therapeutic action. Wormwood, rue, valerian, garlic, onion, hyssop. The smell of a Madhyakaleen apothecary was something between a garden and a kitchen, with an edge of something sharper underneath. But the toolkit also included materials that were, by any modern standard, considerably more challenging. Theriac, one of the most prestigious and expensive compound medicines of the Madhyakaleen period, understood as a universal antidote and general strengthener, was a preparation of sometimes dozens of ingredients that included, in various formulations, viper flesh, opium, and a range of other substances whose combination produced a smell that surviving descriptions suggest was distinctive and powerful. The preparation of theriac was a public ceremony in major cities, performed by licensed apothecaries under civic oversight, partly because the complexity of the recipe and the value of the ingredients made adulteration a real concern, and partly because the production process was sufficiently dramatic to function as a kind of performance of pharmaceutical authority. Wound treatment in the Madhyakaleen period generated its own specific smells. The cauterizing iron, used to seal wounds and stop bleeding, produced the sharp, acrid smell of burning flesh that was a routine accompaniment to surgical work. Plasters applied to infected wounds used materials that varied widely by practitioner, location, and available supply. And the smell of an infected wound being treated with a Madhyakaleen plaster was a combination of the wound itself and whatever was being applied to it, on an environment without antibiotics where wound infection was common and serious. Scholars still debate whether Madhyakaleen medicine, taken as a whole, helped or harmed more patients than it left untreated, whether the interventions available, particularly bloodletting, were on balance beneficial, neutral, or actively damaging to patient outcomes. The debate is complicated by the difficulty of translating Madhyakaleen diagnostic categories into modern disease classifications, by the genuine effectiveness of some herbal treatments, and by the placebo dimensions of a medical encounter in a culture that invested heavily in the authority of the physician and the healing power of treatment itself. What is not in dispute is that the Madhyakaleen sick person inhabited a treatment environment that was aromatic in the fullest sense, an environment in which smell was simultaneously symptom, diagnosis, treatment, and byproduct, in which the body's own odors were read as medical text, and the odors of treatment were understood as therapeutic agents. The physician moving through a Madhyakaleen city carried the smell of their work with them, the blood, the urine, the herbs, the compounds, in a way that marked their profession as clearly as any sign above a door. The lamp in the window above you has dimmed slightly, and the sounds from inside have quieted. Whoever was being treated has been treated, or has given up on treatment, or has fallen asleep. And the night has absorbed the moment with the patient indifference it applies to everything. You stand in the lane, and breathe in. The medicinal sharpness is still there, underneath the general air. It mingles with everything else this city has shown you tonight, the cesspits and the animals and the tanners and the bakers, and together it makes something that is, in its terrible complexity, almost a portrait. A full sensory portrait of a world that was alive in every possible sense of the word. Very, very alive. The lamp above the physician's window has gone dark, and the lane has settled into the particular quiet of a Madhyakaleen city at its deepest night hour that still points somewhere between the last of the evening's business and the first of the morning's preparation, when even the gong farmers seem to pause. When the dogs have found their sleeping spots and the pigs have presumably found theirs, and the only sounds of the distant ones are caught somewhere. A voice raised briefly and then quieted, the soft continuous sound of the river doing its complicated contaminated work in the dark. You walk slowly now, because the night has been long and your pace has adjusted to match the city's, and because there is something in the quality of the dark ahead that asks for slowness. The buildings on either side of you are older here, the timber framing heavier, the plaster between the beams stained with decades of weather and smoke, the foundation settling into the ground with the gradual passions of things that have been there a very long time. The street is quieter. The smell has changed again, shifted into something that is underneath all the other smells you have encountered tonight, something that is not industrial, not animal, not domestic, something that belongs to the long, slow processes of the earth itself. You are walking through a part of the city where the dead are close. Death in a Madhyakaleen city was not sequestered. It was not managed at a distance. Processed in facilities outside the urban boundary, returned to the living in a form that had been carefully prepared to minimize its visible and olfactory reality. Death happened in houses, in streets, in hospitals that were as much places of dying as of healing, in the beds of the poor and in the chambers of the wealthy. And the management of what came after was a communal, immediate, and physically present process that the living conducted in direct proximity to the dead. The expectation of death was woven into the texture of Madhyakaleen daily life in ways that are genuinely difficult to convey to a modern sensibility. Mortality rates, particularly for children, were staggeringly high by modern standards. The majority of children born in a Madhyakaleen city did not survive to adulthood. They were taken by the diseases of infancy and childhood, by accidents, by the periodic famines that swept through even relatively prosperous regions, by the epidemics that moved through densely populated towns with terrible efficiency. Adult mortality from infectious disease was correspondingly high, and the life expectancy figures that historians calculate for the Madhyakaleen period, typically somewhere between 30 and 40 years at birth, though significantly higher for those who survived childhood, reflect a world in which death was not a distant event but a constant, approximate presence. The bodies of the dead in a Madhyakaleen city moved through a specific sequence of handling that was governed by religious custom, practical necessity, and the urgency that the absence of refrigeration imposed on everything. A person who died in the morning would typically be buried by evening or the following morning, not because of callousness, but because the practical realities of organic decomposition in the ambient temperature of a Madhyakaleen city allowed very little time. The preparation of the body washing, wrapping in a shroud, sometimes in the more elaborate preparations of the wealthy involving spices and aromatic substances, happened in the domestic space, in the room where the person had died, by family members or neighbors or the women of the parish who specialized in this work. The smell of recent death and then of the preparation process was a domestic smell in the Madhyakaleen city, something that neighbors knew, that children were present for, that was not hidden behind institutional walls, but was simply part of the rhythm of household life. The aromatic substances used in the preparation of wealthy bodies, frankincense, myrrh, the same resins that appeared in the church, and the pomander served a practical function here, managing the decomposition smell during the period between death and burial, as well as a theological one, connecting the treatment of the dead body to the larger framework of sacred meaning that gave death its place in the Madhyakaleen worldview. For the poor, the preparations were simpler, and the smells less managed: a shroud, the necessary speed, the communal grave, or the parish churchyard. The infrastructure of death for those without resources was functional rather than elaborate, and the sensory reality of it was correspondingly unmediated. The churchyard was the primary burial site for most urban residents. The churchyard was inside the city, not on its outskirts, not outside the walls, but embedded in the urban fabric, surrounded by houses and streets, adjacent to the church that served the living and the dead of the parish simultaneously. Urban churchyards received the dead of their parishes continuously, and in a densely populated city parish, the rate of death could be high enough that the churchyard was in a state of near constant use. Graves were not permanent individual installations in the modern sense. The churchyard was a shared resource, and bodies buried in it would be disturbed when the ground was needed again, their bones moved to charnel houses or ossuaries, buildings adjacent to the church, to make room for new burials. The result of this continuous, high-volume burial in a confined space was that Madhyakaleen urban churchyards were, in the most literal sense, saturated with organic material. The soil of a busy Madhyakaleen churchyard was not ordinary soil. It was a dense, dark, organically rich matrix of decomposed human remains, disturbed and redistributed across generati, eons of use. On warm days, particularly after rain, this soil had its own smell, not the sharp smell of fresh death, but something older, earthier. More fundamental, the smell of organic matter in its most advanced stages of return to the ground. People lived adjacent to this. Children played in churchyards. Parish business was conducted there. The boundary between the space of the dead and the space of the living was permeable and daily crossed in ways that modern sensibilities trained to. Expect a clear separation between these categories find difficult to fully imagine. The plague changed everything about the relationship between death and the city's spatial and sensory organization. And the plague's impact on the smell of Madhyakaleen cities deserves specific attention. The Black Death of 1347-1351 killed somewhere between a third and a half of Europe's population, a mortality event of such scale that the existing infrastructure for managing death was instantly and completely overwhelmed. Parish churchyards that could handle the ordinary rate of death in their communities had no capacity for the death rates of a plague year. When the daily mortality in a large city could run into the hundreds, the response was the plague pit large, communal burial trenches, often outside the city walls, into which the bodies of plague victims were placed in layers, sometimes with lime to accelerate decomposition and manage odor, sometimes without. These pits were large. They received bodies quickly, and they were used in conditions of such urgency and social disruption that the usual careful management of the dead, the washing, the shrouding, the individual grave, the prayers was often impossible. The smell around an active plague pit was something that survivors recorded with a specificity that still carries weight across the centuries. Inside the city during a plague epidemic, death was everyone had unmanaged bodies in houses where everyone had died, undiscovered for days, bodies in streets where people had collapsed. The smell of the city during a major epidemic was, by multiple surviving accounts, something that penetrated everywhere into food, into clothing, into sleep, into the memory of survivors who wrote about it decades later with the vividness of trauma that has not faded. Scholars still argue about the specific pathogen responsible for the Black Death. The dominant theory identifies it as Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. But some historians and scientists have proposed that the extraordinary mortality rates and transmission patterns of the 1347-1351 epidemic suggest a pathogen of different or additional character. The debate continues in the literature, driven by both documentary evidence and the analysis of DNA recovered from burial sites. The church floors above which you are now walking, the old church at the end of this street, its stone walls, dark and heavy in the night, contain the bones of people buried inside, under the flagstones, in the practice of entering the wealthy and the honored within the sacred space itself. The smell of old stone churches in the Madhyakaleen period was not simply incense and cold air. It was those things over a deeper smell, the smell of the ground beneath, of the centuries of organic material compressed under the flagstones, of the long, patient chemistry of the deep past. The church door is closed, and the night is quiet around it. But the ground beneath your feet holds its history with the complete, undemonstrative certainty of things that do not need to announce themselves. You walk past. The stars, where you can see them between the overhanging buildings, are very bright and very far away, and entirely indifferent to the smell. You leave the church behind and follow a narrower lane uphill, because the older, more established parts of a Madhyakalin town tend to occupy higher ground, where defense was easier, and drainage was slightly better, and where the smell, on a good day, with a decent wind, was marginally less concentrated than in the lower streets near the river. The lane climbs between high stone walls, and the stones are old and damp and covered in a dark moss that speaks of consistent moisture. And as you climb, you begin to notice in the wall to your right a series of small openings, not windows, not doorways, but something in between set at intervals along the wall, each one dark and slightly recessed, and producing from its interior a smell that is specific and unmistakable, and that you now recognize with the confident familiarity of someone who has spent an educational evening in close proximity Madhyakalin waste. Management. These are the outlets of a garderobe system. You are walking alongside a castle or a substantial manure house, and you are specifically walking alongside its toilet infrastructure. The garderobe was the Madhyakalin toilet of the wealthy, a small closet built into or projecting from the wall of a castle, tower, or substantial set. One building, equipped with a seat over a shaft that dropped vertically through the thickness of the wall, or in a projecting turret to an outlet at the base of the wall, or into the moat, or into a cesspit below, or in some configurations, simply onto the ground at the base of the wall, and whatever accumulated there. The name garderobe, meaning keep clothes, comes from the original practice of hanging clothing in these small closets, because the ammonia rising from the shaft below was believed to repel moths and preserve the woolens. This tells you something important and slightly wonderful about Madhyakalin practicality. The toilet was also a wardrobe. The smell that everyone else was trying to escape was, in the garderobe, being deliberately harnessed as a pest control strategy. Madhyakalin people found a use for everything. The design of garderobe systems varied enormously depending on the wealth and architectural ambition of the building, and the ingenuity of whoever had planned the construction in a simple castle. A garderobe might be a single closet in the wall of the Lord's chamber, with a shaft dropping to a pit below that was emptied periodically by the castle's equivalent of a gong farmer, a worker whose specific role within the castle household was the maintenance of the sanitary facilities, who was paid for this work, and who occupied a position in the castle's social hierarchy that closely paralleled the position of the gong farmer in the urban hierarchy. Essential, acknowledged, distanced, enlarged, distanced, enlarged, distanced. In larger and more sophisticated castles, the arrangements were more elaborate. Multiple garderobes served different floors and different wings of the building, their shafts sometimes converging in a common pit, or sometimes running separately to different discharge points. The designs of Bodiam Castle in England, Chateau Gaillard in France, and various other Madhyakalin fortifications show considerable architectural attention to the placement and management of sanitary facility. It is evidence that the people who built these structures thought seriously about waste management as a design problem, even if their solutions were limited by the technology available. The moat, that most quintessentially Madhyakalin of defensive features, served multiple purposes in the life of a castle, and not all of them were defensive. A moat filled with water was a barrier to assault. It was also a convenient receptor for the outputs of the garderobe system, and in many castle designs, the garderobe shafts discharged directly into the moat water. The result was a moat that was simultaneously a defensive feature and a sewage channel, its water consistently enriched by the biological contributions of the castle's residents. Its smell on warm days a combination of stagnant water and everything that had been added to it. This had practical implications for the defensive value of the moat, because a moat that was also a sewage channel was genuinely difficult to cross, not just physically as a water barrier, but as a sensory experience. Accounts of castle sieges that required troops to cross or enter moats include details that suggest the challenge was not merely aquatic. The defenders of a castle whose moat served as its sewage system had inadvertently created a biological deterrent of some effectiveness. The management of castle sanitation was a specific area of responsibility within the Madhikaleen household, and the records of large noble establishments and royal castles include references to payments for cesspit cleaning, for the maintenance of garderobe shafts, for the work of keeping the sanitary infrastructure functioning. Royal castles, which housed large households and frequent guests, were scrutinized by visitors whose reactions could have political implications, seem to have invested more consistently in the maintenance of their facilities than smaller establishments. There are records of English royal castles receiving attention to their privy facilities as privy art of general maintenance schedules, with payments recorded for workers who did this cleaning. The smell of castle interiors was shaped significantly by the garderobe arrangement. Garderobe shafts were open at both ends, at the seat above and at the discharge point below, and in castles where the shaft was internal to the wall, rather than in a projecting turret. The shaft functioned as a chimney in reverse, drawing air from outside at the bottom and releasing it, with modifications, into the corridor or chamber where the garderobe closet was located. This meant that the garderobe smell was not fully contained within the closet. It migrated, to varying degrees depending on wind direction and the specific design of the shaft, into the adjacent spaces, tapestries and hangings, which are often understood primarily as decorative elements or as insulation against cold stone walls, also served a practical function in managing the smell of interior spaces in Madhikaleen buildings, absorbing and partially masking the ambient odor of a space that was heated by open fires, occupied by people and sometimes animals, and connected to its garderobe infrastructure through open shafts in the walls. The heavy wool of a Madhikaleen tapestry was, among other things, a smell filter, absorbing over years the accumulated atmosphere of the room it hung in and releasing it slowly, so that a well-used Madhikaleen tapestry was itself an olfactory record of everything that had happened in that room. The street-level equivalent of the garderobe, the public privy, the common toilet facility shared by residents of a street or district who had no private cesspit, was a feature of larger Madhikaleen towns and cities, and it was managed with varying degrees of success by municipal authorities who understood that the alternative to public facilities was the unrestricted use of the street itself, which was worse. Public privies were built over rivers where possible, so that the water carried their outputs away, or the large communal cesspits that required periodic emptying. Their maintenance was a municipal responsibility that was consistently underfunded, inconsistently performed, and a source of regular complaint from the residents of the surrounding streets. London Bridge, that remarkable Madhikaleen structure, combining road crossing with residential and commercial buildings, had public privies built into its structure that discharged directly into the Thames below, a logical arrangement given the availability of the river, and one that contributed in its small way to the Thames's general condition. The bridge privies were documented in various civic records and appear in at least one satirical Madhikaleen poem as an example of the gap between the grandeur of the structure and the practicality of its daily use. Scholars still argue whether the existence of public privy facilities in Madhikaleen cities represents a genuine civic investment in sanitary infrastructure and an early expression of the idea that the city had a responsibility for the sanitary conditions of its residents, or whether it simply represents a pragmatic response to the problem of streets being used as privies in the absence of any alternative. The distinction matters for understanding the development of public health thinking in the Madhikaleen period. But in practice, the facilities themselves, whatever their conceptual underpinning, were often inadequate to the demand they served. The garderobe openings in the wall beside you are dark and silent, their work done for the night. The wall above you rises into the dark, its stones old and slightly damp, and somewhere near the top of it, behind shuttered windows, people are sleeping. People who woke this morning and used these facilities and will wake tomorrow and use them again as naturally and as unreflectively as you use your own, which is to say without thinking about it, because that is what infrastructure does when it works. It removes itself from thought. The shaft in the wall does its quiet, gravity-assisted work. The city continues beneath you, alive in the dark. You carry on uphill, The hill levels out, and you find yourself on a small open space, not quite a square, not quite a courtyard, something in between. The kind of accidental urban clearing that appears in Madhyakaleen towns where several property boundaries have failed to agree with each other and left a small triangle of ground that belongs effectively to everyone and therefore to no one. There is a well here, which you note with the weariness of someone who has recently learned a great deal about the relationship between wells and cesspits. And beside the well, there is a stone trough, and at the trough, in the late-night quiet, a woman is doing laundry. She is working by the light of a small lamp set on the edge of the trough, her sleeves rolled up, her arms moving with the rhythmic, automatic efficiency of someone doing a task they have done thousands of times. The water in the trough arms slightly. She has heated it, which means she has fuel to spare tonight, which means something about her economic situation that you note without dwelling on. She does not look up as you approach. You stop at a respectful distance and watch for a moment, because there is something in the sight of this, the lamplight, the steam, the rhythmic work in the quiet night that is genuinely peaceful, in contrast to everything the last several hours have contained. And then you are close enough to smell the trough, and the peace adjusts slightly. Tonight, we have covered a great deal of ground in the external geography of Madhyakaleen. Smell the streets, the rivers, the industries, the infrastructure. But we have not yet turned to the most intimate dimension of the question, which is the people themselves. What did Madhyakaleen people smell like? What were their personal hygiene practices? How did they manage their own bodies in an environment without running water, without soap in the modern sense? Without deodorant, without the daily shower that most of the modern world now considers a basic operating requirement for social participation? The answer is more complicated and more interesting than the cartoon version that popular culture has sometimes offered, which is simply that. Madhyakaleen people were dirty and smelled terrible and never bathed, and were in general a magnificent advertisement for the invention of modern plumbing. That version is partly true and mostly misleading, and getting the real picture requires unpacking several different threads simultaneously. Start with bathing. The popular belief that Madhyakaleen people never bathed is incorrect, and it is incorrect in ways that historians have been patiently pointing out for several decades without fully dislodging the myth from public consciousness. Madhyakaleen people did bathe. They bathed in rivers and streams in warm months, in wooden tubs filled with heated water in domestic spaces, in the public bathhouses that exist, and, in most towns of any size, in the bathhouses attached to some monasteries and hospitals, and in the natural hot springs that attracted visitors in places where they existed. Bathing was not considered unnatural, unhealthy, or morally suspicious in the early Madhyakaleen period. It was considered normal, desirable, and a mark of civilization. The public bathhouse, the stew in English, the badhouse in German. The etivs in French was a regular feature of Madhyakaleen urban life from at least the 12th century onward, and in larger cities, these establishments were numerous, busy, and socially varied. Some were respectable facilities where people of various social levels came to wash, socialize, and relax. Others were establishments where the bathing was incidental to other services, and the reputation of bathhouses as spaces of sexual commerce was widespread enough to generate periodic ecclesiastical and municipal regulation. The frequency with which people bathed varied enormously by social class, access to facilities, season, and individual preference. Wealthy individuals with private bathing facilities and servants to heat water could bathe as often as they chose, and some clearly bathed regularly. Manuals of courtly behavior from the period recommend bathing, washing the hands before meals, cleaning the teeth, and various other practices that suggest an audience expected to aspire to cleanliness. The practical constraints were greater for the poor. Heating water required fuel, which cost money, and time spent bathing was time not spent working, which was also a cost. But the crucial complication in the Madhyakaleen hygiene picture is that bathing frequency declined significantly in the later Madhyakaleen period. And the reason is one of history's more consequential medical misunderstandings. Following the Black Death and the general anxiety about disease transmission that characterized the later 14th and 15th centuries, medical opinion shifted toward a view that bathing was dangerous, The logic was connected to miasma theory and to the observation empirically correct. The theoretically misunderstood that disease seemed to spread in conditions of warm, moist air. Hot baths, in this framework, opened the pores of the skin, allowing miasma, the corrupt air of the bathhouse, which was after all a warm, humid, enclosed space full of many people, to enter the body more easily. That was exactly backward from the truth, but it was coherent within the theoretical framework available, and it had real effects on behavior. Bathing frequency among the educated and the wealthy, the people most likely to act on medical advice, decreased in the later Madhyakaleen period, replaced by dry cleaning methods, rubbing the skin with linen cloths, changing linen frequently, using aromatic substances to manage body odor. The clean white linen that became a status symbol in later Madhyakaleen and early modern dress served, among other things, as a hygienic tool. It absorbed soot, and skin oils. It could be laundered more easily than outer garments, and its visible whiteness was understood as a marker of cleanliness, even in the absence of regular full body washing. Scholars still argue whether the shift away from regular bathing in the later Madhyakaleen period represents a genuine turning point in European hygiene culture, or whether it has been overstated by historians relying on a limited body of prescriptive sources, the medical and conduct literature, that tells us what people were advised to do rather than what they actually did. The truth is probably that practice continued to vary enormously by region, class, season, and individual circumstance, and that the narrative of a uniform decline in bathing is probably too simple. What people actually smelled like on a daily basis was the product of several factors working simultaneously. Sweat and its bacterial processing were present in the absence of daily bathing, yes, but the Madhyakaleen body, living in a world with a different microbial baseline, had a different relationship to its own bacteria than a modern body does. Body odor, as experienced in the Madhyakaleen period, was partly masked by the general atmospheric context. A person who smells of their own body in an environment that also smells of horses and tanneries and cesspits and wood smoke is a subtly different sensory event than the same person in a modern office. The baseline was different, and the threshold for what was notable was accordingly different. Laundry was done at intervals rather than continuously, and the water for it was collected, heated, and used with the efficiency that scarcity required. The trough at which the woman is working holds water carried from the well, heated over a fire, mixed with whatever cleaning agents were available. Lye made from wood ash dissolved in water was the standard cleaning agent for laundry, effective and cheap, and produced from a byproduct of the hearth fire that every household generated in quantity. It was also as a strongly alkaline solution, not gentle to either fabric or skin, which is one reason that repeated laundering of clothing in the Madhyakaleen period wore out fabric faster than the modern laundry cycle, and why clothing was mended and maintained and passed down and repurposed with a thoroughness that modern fast fashion culture can approximate. Hair was washed, though less frequently than in modern practice, and various herbal preparations were used to manage it: rosemary water, egg-based preparations, vinegar rinses. The management of head lice, which were nearly universal in Madhyakaleen populations across all social classes, occupied a regular place in personal grooming. Fine-toothed lice combs appear in Madhyakaleen archaeological deposits across Europe, in rich contexts and poor ones. Evidence of a universal problem being managed with a universal tool. The woman at the trough wrings out a length of cloth with practiced foes, her arms tensed with the effort, and the wrung water falls back into the trough with a sound that is surprisingly loud in the quiet of the small square. She sets the cloth over the edge of the trough to drain and reaches for the next piece, and the lamp flickers slightly in a small movement of night air, and her shadow moves on the stone wall behind her in a long, slow wave. She is clean, and she is cleaning, and she is doing it at whatever hour she has available to do it, which is the middle of the night, because the day has other requirements. And in that simple, stubborn, entirely ordinary act, there is something that says more about the reality of Madhyakaleen hygiene than any number of generalizations about what people did or did not do with water. They managed with what they had, in the time they had, as well as they could, as they always have. You leave the woman to her work. She has given no indication that she requires either your company or your observation, and the quiet competence of her movements suggests she is getting along perfectly well. And you follow the small square's other exit, a lane that slopes back downhill toward the commercial heart of the town. The night is at that point now where it is closer to morning than to evening, and the darkness has taken on the particular quality of very late night, a deep-held stillness that feels less like the city sleeping and more like the city pausing, drawing breath between the rhythms of rest and renewal. As you descend, the smell changes again, and by this point in the evening, your nose has become something of an instrument, calibrated by experience to read the city's sensory layers with a discrimination you did not have when you arrived. You can identify now individual notes within the general composition, the animal warmth of the stable district to your left, the distant chemical sharpness of the tanning quarter still threading through everything from its position upriver, the wood smoke of banked fires in 100 hearths, the river's permanent bass note beneath it all. And threading through these, something new, something that carries the particular excitement of daytime in its molecules, a smell that is not of the night, but that is beginning to assert itself in advance of the morning, as if the market knows it is coming before the market itself is here. This is the smell of commerce. And in a Madhyakaleen town, commerce smelled extraordinary. The Madhyakaleen market was the economic engine of the town, and in many towns, it was the reason the town existed at all. A chartered market held on specific days, drawing buyers and sellers from the surrounding region into a concentrated space where goods changed hands, prices were set. Informatic life of the community was enacted in physical, olfactory, auditory, and social terms simultaneously. The market was not just an economic event. It was the town's primary performance of itself, the moment when it was most fully what it was. On market days, the central streets and the designated market space filled with stalls, carts, and the people who operated them. And the sensory experience of the result was something that contemporary descriptions reach for with evident excitement and occasional dismay. The sounds were considerable, the calls of traders, the haggling, the animals, the movement of carts and feet on packed ground. The sights were vivid, the colors of textiles, the gleam of metalwork, the stacked produce of the agricultural hinterland brought in by farmers and their families. And the smells were a full, simultaneous expression of everything the Madhyakaleen economy produced and traded. Fish was the dominant note of any market with a seafront connection or river access. And in inland markets, the preserved fish dried, salted, or smoked that traveled from coastal processing centers to every corner of Europe carried its own powerful aromatic signature. Fresh fish, where available, smelled of itself with the blunt authority that fresh fish has always had. Salted fish, herring, cod, stockfish had a different character, something more compressed and intense, the smell of preservation working on a biological substrate. The fish rows of Madhyakaleen markets were typically placed at the edges or downwind, not because anyone had a sophisticated understanding of olfactory management, but because experience taught that proximity to the fish stalls on a warm afternoon had effects on neighboring trade that the neighbors reliably objected to. Meat stalls extended the sensory vocabulary of the shambles into the market space, bringing the smell of fresh cuts, of blood on wood, of fat rendering in the summer heat into proximity with everything else the market offered. The combination of raw meat and warm weather was, in the absence of any refrigeration, managed through the speed of sale and preparation. Meat that did not sell quickly was either preserved, cooked, or in some cases sold at reduced prices at the end of the day, with AF rankness about its condition that modern food labeling has replaced with more euphemistic language. The spice trade brought the Madhyakaleen market its most exotic aromatic dimension, and the stalls of spice merchants were among the most intensely fragrant spaces available in any Madhyakaleen commercial setting. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, saffron, cardamom. These substances had traveled extraordinary distances to reach a market stall in a provincial English, French, or German town, passing through dozens of hands across the trade routes of the Islamic world and the Mediterranean, accumulating in price with every transaction until they arrived in Western Europe as commodities of almost incomprehensible value relative to their volume. The smell of a spice store was therefore not just pleasant, it was the smell of money, of global connection, of the far reaches of a world that most market-goers would never see, but whose aromatic products arrive reliably at the end of long and complicated supply chains. Pepper, which is so ordinary in the modern kitchen that it sits in a grinder beside the salt without anyone thinking about it, was in the Madhyakalin. A luxury item of real significance, valuable enough to be used as a currency for rents and fines in some contexts. Valuable enough that the smell of it in a merchant stall communicated wealth and sophistication to a nose that had learned to read these signals. The dye houses and cloth merchants brought a chemical dimension to the market atmosphere that was distinct from everything else. Wool and linen cloth before sale were processed with dyes whose fixation required mordants, metallic salts, and other chemicals that reacted with the dye in the fiber to create permanent color. Alum, iron sulfate, tannin, chlorine. The mordant chemistry of Madhyakalin Vastra production was complex and aromatic, and the finished cloth carried traces of this chemistry in its fibers that were released gently into the air of the cloth market. Bolts were unrolled and examined. The smell of a cloth market was therefore a mixture of the raw fiber, the dye, the mordant chemistry, and the various finishing treatments fulling which involved pounding the cloth in water. Sometimes water that had been mixed with fuller's earth or urine, tentering, which involved stretching the cloth on frames to dry and set its shape, and various applications of animal fat or plant-based dressings that gave the finished cloth its drape and feel. A Madhyakalin draper handling cloth all day went home smelling of their work in ways that were chemically complex and professionally specific. The livestock market occupied a dedicated space in most towns, the beast market, the cattle market, the horse fair, and its contribution to the sensory economy of market day was unambiguous. Large numbers of animals in a confined space, stressed by transportation and handling, produce waste with a consistency and volume that no amount of straw management can fully contain. The livestock market on a busy day was, by contemporary accounts, among the loudest and most atmospherically intense spaces in the Madhyakalin town, and its location relative to other market activities was something that civic authorities thought about with varying degrees of foresight. Scholars still argue whether the spatial organization of Madhyakalin markets, the clustering of similar trades in specific rows or zones, the fish at the edge, the livestock in a separate area, the luxury goods near the market cross represents a deliberate regulatory imposition by market authorities, or whether it emerged organically from the practical preferences of traders who understood that certain proximities worked and others did not. The evidence suggests both processes operated, often simultaneously, and that the resulting geography of the market was a palimpsest of organic development and deliberate intervention. The herbalists and the apothecaries brought the most medically inflected smells to the market, the dried herbs, the prepared medicines, the aromatic substances that served both therapeutic and culinary purposes. The boundary between medicine and food being considerably less distinct in the Madhyakalin period than it is today. A market stall selling dried lavender, dried wormwood, prepared theriac, and pickled ginger was operating in a space where pharmacy and cookery overlapped without apology, and the smell of it was accordingly both medicinal and appetizing. The market is not here tonight. The stalls are absent, the space empty, the smell residual rather than active. But the residue is there in the ground of the market square, in the wooden surfaces of the permanent stalls that line its edges, in the general atmosphere of a space that has been used for commerce for generations and carries the accumulated sensory memory of every market day. In its material fabric, you stand in the empty market square, and the ghost of 10,000 market days is in the air around you. Blood and fish and dye and livestock and fresh bread and the human smell of crowds and the animal smell of wealth moving through hands. And it is, in its way, magnificent, the most alive thing you have encountered all night. You sit for a moment on the edge of the empty market stone well cover, not the well itself. You have learned your lessons about wells and let the quiet of the square settle around you. The market ghost fades, and what replaces it is the actual night, the actual empty space, the actual smell of absence where the day's commerce has been. Your feet are tired, which is historically accurate because Madhyakaleen streets were not designed for comfort, and the ground you have been walking on has been the product of centuries of organic accumulation rather than anything designed for the ease of pedestrian traffic. It is in this quiet moment that you become aware of something you have been walking past all evening without fully attending to the spaces between the building. The alleys and doorways and shadowed corners where the lamplight does not reach, where the city's invisible population lives its invisible life. Because the Madhyakaleen city was not populated only by the bakers and the tanners and the gong farmers and the merchants and the physicians. It was populated also by the people who inhabited the margins of all those economies, the people for whom the city's systems, such as they were, had never been designed, and to whom its protections were most inconsistently extended. You see a small shape in a doorway across the square, then another beside the first. Children sleeping in a doorway at this hour of the night. And even from here you can read the situation and the quality of their positioning, the way they are folded against each other for warmth, the way the older one has arranged their body around the younger one in the instinctive geometry of protection, the way neither of them has a blanket, which means neither of them has a home in any sense. That includes a blanket. Street children in Madhyakaleen towns were a constant presence and a consistently acknowledged social problem. Acknowledged in the sense that they appeared in the records of hospitals, monasteries, civic institutions, and legal proceedings, generating documentation that allows historians to say with confidence that they existed in significant numbers, that their lives were characterized by specific and predictable hardships, and that the social response to their existence was a mixture of charity, exploitation, indifference, and occasional genuine care that mirrors the complexity of social responses to child poverty in every era. The children of the Madhyakaleen street inhabited the sensory world of the city at its most unmediated at ground level, without the protections of domestic walls, without the management of smell and contamination that even a modest household provided, without the seasonal adjustment that having a home allows. They slept where the city's auger, neat, material was thickest in doorways and against walls where the ground had its heaviest accumulation, in spaces beside middens and near the drainage channels that carried the street's liquid waste, because these were the spaces that offered some protection from wind and from the attention of people who might move them on. The smell of the Madhyakaleen street at ground level was different from the smell at adult height, denser, wetter, more actively biological, closer to the decomposition processes happening in the accumulated organic layer, and that was the street surface. Children who lived in this space full-time inhabited a microbial environment of extraordinary richness, which conferred at significant cost in early mortality immunological adaptations that allowed many of them to survive conditions that would rapidly disable an adult from a clean environment. This is not a silver lining. It is a mechanism operating with complete indifference to the cost it extracted. The economic survivals, strategies of street children in Madhyakaleen towns were as varied as the children themselves and as circumscribed by their circumstances. The most fundamental was begging, the direct solicitation of alms from passers-by, which was practiced within a theological and social framework that understood charitable giving as a spiritual obligation of the giver, and the presence of the poor as a necessary feature of a world in which the virtue of charity needed objects. Madhyakaleen Christianity had a complex and ambivalent relationship to poverty. It was simultaneously a sign of spiritual danger, a state of vulnerability deserving compassion, and a condition that served the spiritual needs of the wealthy by providing them with opportunities for charitable merit. This theological framework meant that begging was, within limits, socially tolerated in ways that it has not always been in subsequent eras, and that the beggar's position in the urban social landscape, while low, was not without its acknowledged place. Beggars congregated at church doors, at market entrances, at the gates of monasteries and hospitals, at the intersections of busy streets wherever the flow of people with resources was greatest and the social expectation of charitable response was strongest. Children were particularly effective beggars. And the evidence suggests that some of the street children documented in Madhya records were operating as part of organized begging operations. Their presence and their condition managed by adults who took a portion of their earnings. The other major economic strategy available at the bottom of the Madhya urban economy was scavenging the collection and sale of whatever the city's more formal economies discarded. We have already encountered the pure finders, who collected dog feces for the tanneries. Below and alongside them were people who collected the other discarded materials of the city's daily life rags for the paper-making industry that was developing in the later medieval period. Bones for the bone boilers, who rendered them for grease and produced from their work one of the more pungent of all Madhya industrial smells: metal scraps, broken pottery, the leavings of the fish market, and the butcher stalls that were not good enough for human food but were good enough for other things. The bone boilers deserve a moment of attention in any survey of Madhya urban smell, because they occupied a specific and particularly intense position in the sensory geography of the city. Rendering bones for grease involved boiling large quantities of bones in water, a process that produced a smell that contemporary sources describe with a vividness that suggests it penetrated the consciousness of everyone in the vicinity in ways that lingered. Bone boiling operations were, in many towns, subject to regulatory attempts at relocation pushed to the edges of the urban area, outside the walls if possible, because their impact on the surrounding atmosphere was considered unacceptable even by the relatively permissive standards of Madhya urban regulation. Whether these regulatory attempts were successful and how consistently they were enforced varied by place and period. The poorest residents of the Madhya city experienced the city's smells at full, unmediated intensity, without the buffers that money could buy. Not just the palmanders and the herb-strewn floors of the wealthy, but the simpler buffers of having walls, having a fire, having the ability to choose which streets to walk down and when. Poverty in the Madhya city was not just an economic condition. It was a sensory condition, a specific relationship to the physical environment of the street that was more intimate, more exposed, and more demanding than the relationship of those who could afford a door to close between themselves and the outside world. The hospitals and almshouses that represented the Madhya period's institutional response to poverty, funded by charitable bequests, run by charitable religious orders, providing food and shelter and rudimentary medical care to the sick and the destitute, were themselves complex sensory environments. A Madhya hospital ward housing many sick people in close quarters was warm, dim, and aromatic in ways that mixed the therapeutic herbs and incense that the attendants used with the biological reality of many ill bodies in an enclosed space. The care that was provided was genuine, and the commitment of those who provided it was often extraordinary. But the conditions were, by modern standards, challenging in ways that extended well beyond the olfactory. The two children in the doorway have not moved. The older one has adjusted slightly, pulling the younger one closer, and the movement is so automatic, so deeply habitual, that it happens without either of them waking. It is a small, complete act of care conducted in the dark, in a doorway, in a Madhya city that is not looking at them. You look at them for a moment. The city breathes a row. All three of you, it smells and it sounds and its darkness. And you feel, with a clarity that the long night has sharpened, the full weight of what it meant to be at the bottom of this world. Not the picturesque poverty of historical imagination, not the quaint hardship of period drama, but the real, physical, sensory, daily experience of a life lived entirely at the mercy of everything the city produced and discarded. The night is very quiet. The stars are still bright where the buildings allow them. You leave the children to their sleep and move on, gently, into the dark. You move away from the market square through a passage between two buildings, a covered walkway. Its ceiling low enough that you can feel the change in air as you enter it, the temperature dropping slightly, the smell concentrating in the enclosed space before releasing you at the other end into a wider street where the church stands. Not the old church from earlier, a different one. Larger. Its tower rising above. The surrounding roof line into the night sky with the calm, unhurried authority of a building that was built to outlast everything around it and has been succeeding at this project for several centuries. The church door is open. This is not unusual. Many Madhyakaleen churches remained open through the night, available for prayer, for shelter, for the various devotional practices that were not confined to daylight hours in a culture where the sacred and the daily were not separated by the kind of institutional boundary that modern secularism tends to impose between them. Light comes from inside. Candles, several of them burning at an altar somewhere in the interior. Their light reaching the doorway in a warm amber glow that is the most genuinely welcoming thing you have seen since the baker's cat. You step inside. The smell hits you immediately, and it is complicated. It is the smell of stone, first of all, that specific mineral coldness that old stone buildings carry regardless of how warm air inside them is. A smell that is geological, ancient, slightly damp, entirely distinct from any biological or chemical process. And over the stone, and through it, and transforming it incense, not fresh incense burning now, but the accumulated residue of years and decades of incense burning soaked into the stone walls and the wooden furnishings and the fabric of the hangings, releasing itself slowly and continuously into the air of the interior, so that the church smells of incense even when no incense is burning. It is a ghost smell, a memory smell, the smell of every service that has ever been held in this building, compressed and preserved in the material of the walls themselves, and underneath the incense, underneath everything, rising from the floor, that other smell, the one you identified when you walked past the old church earlier, the deep, earthen, ancient smell of the ground beneath the flagstones, where generations of the parish's dead lie in their layered rest, country, bolting their slow chemistry to the atmosphere of the space above them in a way that the incense and the candle smoke and the cold stone do not quite cover, do not quite transform, but that they contextualize, frame in a theological sense within a larger meaning that changes how the smell is received. The use of incense in Christian worship had been continuous since the early centuries of the church, inherited from Jewish temple practice and from the broader Mediterranean religious culture in which Christianity emerged, and it carried multiple meanings simultaneously that reinforced each other in the specific context of Madhyakaleen Catholic practice. Theologically, incense was connected to prayer. Its rising smoke was a visual metaphor for prayer ascending toward God, a connection explicit in the Psalms and developed extensively in Christian liturgical commentary. The smell of incense was therefore not just pleasant or practical, but meaningful. It was a sacred smell, a smell associated with the presence of the divine, a smell that participation in worship was supposed to produce, in that the production of was understood as itself a devotional act. Practically, incense served as a fumigant. Burning resins released compounds that had genuine antimicrobial properties, and the continuous burning of incense in a space where large numbers of people gathered regularly was not entirely without effect on the microbial quality of the air, even if the effect was modest compared to what modern ventilation and disinfection can achieve. The practical and the theological work together here, in the same way they worked together in the pumenda and the herb-strewn floor. The Madhyakaleen sacred and the Madhyakaleen practical were not separate categories operating in parallel, but a single integrated system in which spiritual meaning and physical management were aspects of the same act. The theology of smell in Madhyakaleen Christianity was developed and explicit in ways that the modern church has largely set aside. The distinction between sweet smells and foul smells was mapped onto the distinction between the sacred and the sinful, the pure and the corrupt, the divine and the demonic, in a framework that gave sensory experience a direct moral and spiritual significance. The sweet smells incense, flow, aras. The aromatic exhalations attributed to the bodies of certain saints were signs of sanctity, of divine favor, of spiritual purity. Foul smells were signs of corruption, in both the physical and moral sense, signs of sin, of disease understood as spiritual as well as physical disorder, of the proximity of evil. The odor of sanctity, the sweet smell supposedly emanating from the bodies of saints both during their lives and after their deaths, was a specific and important category in Madhyakaleen hagiography, the literature of saints' lives. Saints were reported to smell of roses, of lilies, of incense, of a sweetness that had no natural source, and that was therefore understood as evidence of their holiness, their bodies transformed by spiritual purity into something that transcended the ordinary biological processes that made ordinary bodies smell as they did. The bodies of saints were sometimes reported to be incorrupt, not decomposing after death in the normal way, and this incorruption was accompanied by sweet smell, rather than the smell of decomposition, a miraculous reversal of the natural order that served as evidence of the saint's special status. This theology had practical implications for how Madhyakaleen people interpreted and responded to the smells of their environment. A space that smelled bad was, in this framework, not just unpleasant but spiritually contaminated in a sense that went beyond the physical, associated with disease and sin and the presence of forces hostile to human well-being. The fumigation of sick spaces with aromatic burning substances was therefore simultaneously a medical intervention, a spiritual purification, and a practical acknowledgement of the connection between smell and disease that miasma theory had established. The church's fumigation rituals, the swinging of the thurible, the censing of the altar and the congregation, the burning of specific resins at specific moments in the liturgy were expressions of this integrated understanding, and their regular performance in the context of daily and weekly worship meant that the smell of incense was deeply conditioned into the sensory memory of everyone who participated in Madhyakaleen Catholic practice, which was effectively the entire population of Western Europe. To smell incense was to be in the presence of the sacred, and the smell of the sacred was specifically distinguished from the smell of the everyday world outside the church doors. The church also attempted, at various points and through various mechanisms, to manage the smell of its immediate urban environment, not just the interior of the building, but the street outside, the churchyard, the spaces adjacent to the sacred precincts. Regulations about what activities could be conducted in the immediate vicinity of churches, about what could be deposited in churchyards, about the maintenance of the space immediately surrounding the sacred building. These reflected an understanding that the sacred and the profane were in continuous sensory contact in the Madhyakaleen city, and that some management of that contact was necessary. Scholars still argue whether the Madhyakaleen Church's engagement with smell, its theology of sacred and profane odor, its liturgical use of incense, its fumigation practices represents a coherent proto-hygienic program operating within a religious framework, or whether the practical health effects of these practices were entirely incidental to their theological purpose. The question is probably the wrong one, because it assumes a separation between the religious and the practical that Madhyakaleen people would not have recognized. They were doing one thing, which was managing the sacred and the profane in their full complexity, and that one thing happened to have effects at multiple levels simultaneously. The candles at the altar burn with their small, steady flames, and the incense ghost in the walls breathes around you with its ancient accumulated warmth. The floor beneath your feet is cold stone, and beneath the cold stone, the parish dead lie in their long rest, and above them, the living have been praying and singing and burning incense and breathing together for 200 years or more. And the accumulated smell of all of that is here in the air. Not unpleasant, not entirely pleasant, but complete, a full record of a community's spiritual life, preserved in the material of the building that contained it. You sit in a pew for a moment. The wood is worn smooth by generations of use. The candle flames are very still in the absence of any draught. The smell of the church settles around you like something that has been waiting, patient, accumulated, complex. And in the quality of that patience, there is something genuinely restful. You breathe in stone and incense and beeswax and old wood and the deep earthen undertone of the floor. It is not a clean smell, but it is a whole one. And somewhere in its complexity, it is almost beautiful. You sit in the pew, a little longer than you meant to. The worn wood and the candle warmth and the accumulated incense quiet have a quality that your body, after several hours of navigating the Madhyakaleen street, receives with something close to gratitude. But the city is still out there, and the night is moving toward its end. And there is more to understand before the dawn comes, and the whole sensory apparatus of the Madhyakaleen day starts up again with its full Committed energy. You leave the church quietly, pulling the door to behind you, and step back into the street. The night air is cold now, properly cold, the deep cold of the hours just before dawn. And in the cold, the smells have changed their character again, become more crystalline, somehow more separate from each other, as if the cold has reduced everything to its essential components and arranged them in the air with the spare precision of winter. You can smell the river from here, and the distant tanneries, and the wood smoke of the last banked fires, and underneath all of it, the fundamental smell of the city itself, the organic, layered, deeply historical smell of ground that has been inhabited continuously for a very long time. And it is this smell, this fundamental, inescapable, ambient smell of the inhabited Madhyakaline city that brings us to what is perhaps the most interesting question of the whole evening. What did people do about it? Not the gong farmers, not the physicians, not the church with its incense and its theology of sacred odor, but the civic authorities, the people with the nominal power to regulate the conditions of urban life. What did they try to do? How much did they try, and how well did it work? The answer, compressed to its essence, is more than you might expect, less than was needed, and with an enforcement record that would not inspire confidence in any modern regulatory agency. But the attempt itself is interesting. Interesting as evidence of how Madhyakaline people understood their own urban environment, and what they believed could and should be done about its most challenging features. The history of Madhyakaline urban sanitation regulation is longer and more detailed than its reputation suggests. The popular image of the Madhyakaline city as a place where everyone simply accepted whatever conditions prevailed, where no one thought to object or organize, where civic authority was either absent or indifferent to the quality of daily life. This image is wrong, and it is wrong in ways that the documentary record makes clear. Madhyakaline cities were governed. They had laws, they had officials, they had courts, and they used all of these to address the conditions of urban life with an energy that varied by city, by hour, and by the specific crisis at hand. But that was real and consistent enough to leave a substantial paper trail. London's regulatory record is among the most extensively documented, and it reveals a city that was in continuous, largely unsuccessful negotiation with its own filth throughout the Madhyakaline period. From the 13th century onward, London's civic authorities issued repeated orders addressing the condition of the streets, orders requiring householders to clean the street in front of their properties, orders prohibiting the dumping of waste in specific locations, orders requiring the removal of dung hills that had accumulated beyond acceptable size, orders about where butchers could dispose of offal, orders about where tanners could operate, orders about the condition of the Thames banks. The repetition of these orders is itself the most significant thing about them. An order that was issued once and complied with did not need to be issued again. The fact that the same orders, sometimes in almost identical language, appear in London's civic records across decades, sometimes across centuries, tells you that compliance was partial, enforcement inconsistent, and the underlying conditions driving the problem unchanged. The dung hills that were ordered removed in 1281 were back in various forms and locations when similar orders were issued in 1309 and again in 1345. The butchers who were ordered to cease dumping offal in the Thames in one decade were generating similar orders in the next. This was not primarily a failure of will on the part of the city's authorities. It was a failure of capacity, a gap between what the regulations required and what the enforcement mechanisms available could actually deliver. Madhyakaline London had a system of ward officials, aldermen, beadles, constables whose responsibilities included the enforcement of sanitary regulations among their other duties. These officials were part-time, unpaid or modestly compensated, dependent on the cooperation of their neighbors and operating without the institutional backing, the legal clarity, and the physical infrastructure that effective environmental regulation requires. The fines for violations were real. Records show specific individuals being présentés at civic courts for specific violations of sanitary ordinances, and fines being levied and sometimes collected. But the fines were often too small to function as effective deterrents for people whose livelihood depended on the practices being regulated. and the coverage of the enforcement system was uneven enough that the risk of detection and prosecution was, for many people, low. The rational calculation for a butcher deciding whether to dump offal in the river or transport it to a designated disposal site at personal expense. An inconvenience was not always resolved in favor of compliance. Paris developed an interesting parallel regulatory tradition, and the French records reveal similar patterns: ambitious ordinances, enthusiastic initial enforcement, gradual relaxation, periodic crisis-driven renewal. The Prévost of Paris issued regulations about street cleaning and waste disposal repeatedly throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, and the attempts to establish a professional street cleaning service workers paid by the city to maintain the streets represent an early experiment in municipal sanitation that was, in various forms, tried and abandoned and tried again across the Modicaline period. The specific problem of water quality generated perhaps the most sustained regulatory attention in Modicaline cities, because the connection between contaminated water and illness, while theoretically misunderstood, was practically observed often enough to motivate real action. Attempts to separate water sources from waste disposal, establishing protected zones around wells and conduits, restricting the operations of polluting industries near water sources. Maintaining the cleanliness of public water facilities appear in the records of cities across Europe with a consistency that suggests a widespread, if imperfect, understanding of the relationship between water management and public health. The regulation of specific industries, tanners, butchers, dyers, bone boy, others generated the most contentious and the most revealing regulatory disputes, because these industries were economically important, politically organized through their guilds, and operating in ways that were genuinely incompatible with the quality of life of their neighbors. The disputes between tanning guilds and city authorities over the location and operating conditions of tanneries dragged on across decades in city after city, resolving sometimes in relocation, sometimes in compromise operating conditions, sometimes in the effective victory of the guild over the regulators depending on the relative political weight of the parties involved. Scholars still argue whether the Modicaline regulatory tradition around urban sanitation represents a genuine precursor to modern public health and early, halting development of the idea that the state has a responsibility for the sanitary conditions of its citizens, or whether it is better understood as a series of disconnected responses to specific problems, without any underlying coherent philosophy of public health connecting them. The question matters for how we understand the intellectual history of public health. But the practical history is clear enough. Modicaline cities tried repeatedly and with genuine effort to manage the sensory and sanitary conditions of urban life, and they succeeded partially and inconsistently. The gap between their ambitions and their achievements was filled by the accumulated organic material of the city's daily life, layer by patient layer. The street you are walking down has a drainage channel along one edge, a stone-lined gutter that is supposed to carry the street's liquid waste toward the river, and it is doing this job with moderate success. Its current slowed by accumulated debris, but still moving, still carrying something toward somewhere. Beside the gutter, on a corner, there is a wooden post with a notice on it. An official notice you can tell by the seal at the bottom, though the a sight is too poor to read the text. You can guess what it says. Some version of "Do not dump waste here. Remove your dung hills. Keep the street clean." The penalty for violation is something that the violators have calculated against the probability of enforcement and found acceptable. The notice flaps slightly in the cold, pre-dawn air, patient and largely ignored, doing its best. You understand exactly how it feels. The cold is deeper now than it has been all night. And you pull your well. You do not have a cloak, because you did not plan for this particular evening's itinerary, which is a metaphor of some kind for the entire experience of walking through a Modicaline city without having been born in one. You fold your arms instead, and you walk, and the walking generates its own warmth, and in the warmth and the motion and the deep quiet of the pre-dawn street, something shifts in your relationship to the city around you. It is hard to say exactly when it happened at what point in the layer. Several hours. The smell went from being an assault to being a condition. From being something that demanded your attention at every breath to being simply the air of this particular place, the atmospheric century of this particular world. But it has happened. Somewhere between the tanneries and the church, between the cesspit lane and the market square, between the physician's window and the children in the doorway, your nose has done what noses do when the stimulation is continuous and sustained and inescapable. It has adapted. Not permanently, you would notice the smell again immediately if you left and came back, as any Madhyakaleen traveler arriving in a city after days in the clean air of the countryside could attest. But for now, in this moment, walking through the pre-dawn streets of a city you have been inhabiting for hours, the smell is background. It is context. It is, in the most technical sensory biological sense of the term, normal. This is olfactory fatigue. And it is one of the most important and most underappreciated mechanisms in the story of how Madhyakaleen people lived in Madhyakaleen cities without being incapacitated by the sensory conditions of their environment. The human olfactory system, unlike vision or hearing, adapts to constant stimulation with remarkable speed and thoroughness. A smell that is overwhelming on first encounter can become essentially undetectable within minutes to hours of continuous exposure, as the olfactory receptors saturate and the brain, receiving no new information from the unchanging signal, progressively reduces its attentional weight. Madhyakaleen urban residents, born into the sensory environment of their city and living in it continuously, were not experiencing the Madhyakaleen street the way you have been experiencing it tonight. They were not holding their breath past the tanneries or steeling themselves before rounding the corner near the shambles. The smells that have been demanding your attention all evening were for them the baseline, the normal, unremarkable background against which other sensory information registered. A particularly bad day might notice itself. A particularly acute event might break through the adapted baseline. But the general ambient smell of the Madhyakaleen city was for its inhabitants simply what air smelled like. This has a significant implication for how we interpret Madhyakaleen sources that describe urban smells. When a Madhyakaleen chronicle mentions the intolerable stench of a particular location or event, that description is coming from a sensory baseline that was already substantially higher than ours, which means the events that broke through that baseline and registered as remarkable were, by modern standards, extraordinary indeed. The cesspit collapses and plague pit descriptions and tannery complaints that made it into the written record were not the average experience of the Madhyakaleen city. They were the events that exceeded even the adapted threshold of people already live, in conditions that would floor a modern visitor. The folk remedies and coping strategies that Madhyakaleen people deployed against the worst of their sensory environment were varied, practical, and woven so thoroughly into daily life that many of them appear in the sources not as special measures but as ordinary domestic practice things that everyone did without needing to be told because everyone had always done them, and the logic was self-evident. Vinegar was perhaps the most versatile of these practical tools. Cheap, widely available, genuinely antimicrobial, sharp enough to cut through other smells, and understood within the medical framework of the time as a protective substance that countered the corrupting influence of bad air. People held vinegar-soaked cloths to their noses in particularly contaminated environments. They washed surfaces with it. They added it to drinking water as a purifying agent. During plague epidemics, vinegar was used extensively as a fumigant and protect. If measure applied to clothing, to surfaces, to the body, to the doors and walls of houses where plague had been present. Spiced wine occupied a similar position. At the upper end of the economic scale, the addition of spices to wine served culinary purposes. But the aromatic complexity of heavily spiced wine also created a powerful competing smell that could dominate other sensory inputs. And the practice of drinking spiced wine in crowded, closed social settings where the atmosphere was challenging was partly medicinal in the Madhyakaleen understanding, the spices purifying the air, the wine warming and strengthening the body's defenses. The burning of aromatic substances in domestic spaces, juniper, rosemary, lavender, various resins was a regular household practice that served simultaneously as air management, pest control, and spiritual protection. Juniper, in particular, was understood as a specific against plague and pestilence, and its burning during epidemic periods was recommended by medical authorities and practiced widely across social levels. Whether it helped in any direct sense is uncertain. That it changed the smell of the space in which it was burned is certain. And in a world where smell was health, changing the smell was changing the health environment. The consumption of strongly aromatic foods, heavily spiced dishes built around garlic and onion and leek. The robust herbal flavors of Madhyakaline cuisine was partly a matter of taste and partly a matter of preservation. But the aromatics that made Madhyakaline food smell and taste the way it did also contributed to the sensory environment of the household and the body, in ways that the Miasma framework understood as protective. Garlic, in particular, appears repeatedly in Madhyakaline medical literature as a protective food recommended during plague and pestilence, and its powerful aromatic properties were understood as part of its therapeutic action. The psychology of coping with an olfactory environment as challenging as the Madhyakaline city involved not just these physical tools, but also a set of perceptual and attitudinal adaptations that are harder to document, but not impossible to infer. The dark humor that surrounds the worst of the Madhyakaline waste management record nearly sources the slightly too detailed accounts of cesspit disasters, the satirical poems about the conditions of specific streets, the deadpan civic records of repeated, failed interventions suggests a population that had found in humor a way to maintain a relationship with conditions that could not be fully controlled or escaped. Laughing at the cesspit that swallowed the nobility is not just entertainment. It is a coping mechanism. It is a way of asserting cognitive distance from conditions that were physically inescapable. There was also, threading through the Madhyakaline relationship to the sensory conditions of urban life, something that we might call acceptance. Not the passive acceptance of people who have given up, but the active, practiced acceptance of people who have correctly identified the limits of what can be changed and have redirected their energy accordingly. The Madhyakaline city could not be made clean in the modern sense. The infrastructure did not exist. The theory was wrong, and the resources were insufficient. Given these conditions, the question was not how to make the city smell like nothing, but how to live well inside the city as it actually was. And the pomanders and the herb-strewn floors and the spiced wine and the burned juniper and the vinegar washes were all answers to that question. Partial and practical and genuinely effective within their limits. The dawn is beginning now, not yet visible in the sky, which is still dark, but present as a quality of change in the air, a slight softening of the cold, a faint gray at the very edge of perception in the direction of the east. The birds that have been silent through the deep night are beginning tentatively to consider the possible. A sound, one call, uncertain, somewhere in the roofline above you. Then silence. Then another, slightly more committed. The city is about to wake up. The bakers are already at it. You can smell if you pay attention. The first breath of the morning's bread threading through the pre-dawn air, warm and round and yeasty. The smell of another day beginning its long negotiations with the world. Your nose receives it with something that has become, over the course of this long night, genuinely and complicatedly fond. The gray at the edge of the sky is deepening now. Not yet light, not quite dawn, but the specific quality of darkness that precedes dawn, which is different from the darkness of midnight in ways that the body knows before the eyes confirm it. The cold has reached its lowest point and will from here begin its slow retreat. The birds in the roofline are more committed now, their calls less tentative, building toward the full morning chorus that will, in an hour, make the cities sound like a different place, entirely brighter, more insistent, the soundscape of a world that has remembered it is supposed to be awake. You have been walking these streets for the entire night. You have been in the tannery district, and the shambles and the cesspit lane, and the market square, and the physician's neighborhood, and the churchyard's edge, and the church itself, and the garderobe aisle, and the bakehouse doorway, and the small square with the well, and the woman doing laundry in the lamplight. You have smelled things that your 21st century nose will spend some time processing. You have encountered a pig, several pigs, and a horse at the worst possible angle, and the accumulated organic biography of a city that has been alive and working and producing and decomposing for several hundred years without pause. Now, in the last minutes of this long night, the question that has been threading through everything is ready to resolve itself. Not into an answer exactly, but into a perspective, a way of seeing how the world you have been walking through became the world you live in, and what was lost and what was gained in the long, slow, uneven transition between them. The smell of the Madhyakaleen city did not disappear overnight. It did not end with a specific invention or a specific date or a specific civic decision. It changed gradually, unevenly, differently in different places and at different rates, driven by forces that were sometimes deliberate and sometimes entirely accidental. And that worked together in a combination too complex to reduce to a single narrative. The Black Death was, paradoxically, one of the forces that began to change the Madhyakaleen city's sensory landscape, not because it motivated a sudden hygienic revolution, but because it killed so many people that the cities it swept through were afterward less densely populated. And lower population density meant lower concentrations of everything that population density produced. The streets of a post-plague city were, for a generation or two, less crowded, the cesspits less strained, the rivers receiving less input from fewer people. This was a terrible way to achieve an improvement, and the improvement was temporary populations recovered. Cities refilled, the pressures returned. But the demographic disruption of the mid-14th century created a brief window in which the worst excesses of Madhyakaleen urban accumulation were reduced, and that window had effects that rippled forward in ways that are difficult to trace but real. The shift in medical understanding, the slow, contested, centuries-long movement away from miasma theory toward a germ theory of disease changed the relationship between urban authorities and sanitary regulation in ways that ultimately transformed the city's infrastructure. As long as miasma theory held, the logic of sanitary intervention was focused on smell, remove bad smells, introduce good ones, fumigate spaces where bad air had been present. The interventions that followed from this logic were real and sometimes effective, but they were not targeted at the actual mechanisms of disease transmission, and so they were always partially misdirected. When the understanding shifted, when John Snow mapped the Broad Street cholera pump in 1854, and Pasteur and Koch and their contemporaries established germ theory on solid experimental ground in the latter half of the 19th century, the logic of sanitary intervention shifted with it toward infrastructure, clean water supply, underground sewage, waste removal systems that address the actual biological mechanisms of disease rather than its aromatic symptoms. The great engineering projects of the 19th century London sewer system, Paris's renovation under Haussmann, the clean water projects of American and European cities were the practical expression of a changed theoretical understanding. And their effect on the smell of cities was a byproduct of their effect on the health of cities. But between the Madhyakaleen cesspit and the Victorian sewer lay several centuries of incremental, halting, even changed the development of enclosed privies that managed waste more effectively than open pits, the gradual improvement of urban water supplies, the slow retreat of livestock from city centers as urban economies became less directly agricultural, the development of soap making as an accessible industry that brought cleaning agents within reach of more people, the gradual movement of the most noxious industries, tanneries, bone boilers, slaughterhouses to the urban periphery, and then outside city limits entirely. Each of these changes reduced, by a small increment, one of the layers of the Madhyakaleen city's sensory composition. The animals left first, or rather, they left gradually, pushed out by the combination of changing urban economics, increasing civic regulation, and the simple pressure of rising land values that made keeping livestock in city centers progressively less economical. The livestock markets retreated to the edges of cities, then to dedicated facilities outside the urban boundary. The slaughterhouses followed, eventually becoming the invisible, distant facilities that modern urban residents never see or smell or think about. The tanneries went to industrial zones. The bone boilers went wherever they could still operate without generating immediate complaint. What remained for a long time was the street itself, the accumulated organic material of centuries of inhabited ground, and the problem of human waste. which persisted as an urban challenge well into the industrial period. The night soil trade, the collection and agricultural sale of human waste from urban cesspits, continued in many cities into the 19th century. Conducted by workers whose social position and working conditions were not dramatically different from those of their Madhyakaleen predecessors. The sensory conditions of urban poverty remained extreme long after the sensory. Conditions of urban wealth had been transformed by plumbing and clean water and soap. Scholars still argue about the timeline and the drivers of this transformation, whether it was primarily a story of scientific progress or of economic development, or of political change, or of simple demographic pressure, reaching a point where the old arrangements broke down beyond repair. Probably it was all of these things, operating at different rates in different places, with no single cause and no single turning point. What changed finally and fundamentally was not just the infrastructure, but the sensory expectation, the baseline against which people measured what normal air was supposed to smell like. As cities cleaned up, the adapted baseline of urban residents shifted, and what had once been unremarkable became first noticeable, then unacceptable. The process worked in both directions. Improving conditions raised expectations, which demanded further improvements, which raised expectations further. The loop, once started, has continued to the present day, which is why a modern city, which would smell extraordinary to a Madhyakaleen visitor, still generates complaints from its residents about smells that Madhyakaleen inhabitants would not have been able to detect above the general ambient roar of their own sensory environment. The sky to the east is unambiguously grey now. The first thin light is present not as illumination yet, but as a reduction of darkness, the shapes of buildings against the sky becoming distinct, the geometry of the street reasserting itself in the growing visibility. The birds are fully committed. Somewhere nearby, a door opens and closes, and the smell of a newly lit fire comes briefly and cleanly through the cold air. A man appears at the far end of the street, a baker's boy probably, or an apprentice, moving briskly through the cold with the purposeful energy of someone who has been up since before dawn and has things to do. He passes without looking at you. Hi. Breath, a small cloud in the cold air, his feet certain on the familiar ground. The city is waking up. Another Madhyakaleen day is about to begin. Another day of animals and cesspits and tanneries and markets and bakers and physicians and gong farmers, and the small, stubborn, endlessly varied business of being alive in a world that requires constant management and offers no easy conditions and rewards, always. The people who adapt and persist and find a way. You have spent a night in that world, and you have not, as predicted, entirely survived it, not because anything hurt you, but because something has changed in you. Some easy assumption about the clean distance between your world and this one? The distance is real. The change is also real. And the thread connecting them running through the cesspit and the tannery and the church and the market and the children in the doorway is the simple, indestructible thread of human life continuing in whatever conditions, at whatever cost, with whatever tools were available. The morning light is coming. The city smells of itself, fully and without apology. You have been here all night. You know what that means now. The light is fully here now, soft and grey and gentle, the particular light of early morning before the sun has cleared the roofline. A light that makes everything look slightly unfinished, slightly provisional, as if the world is still deciding what it wants to be today. The city is waking around you in stages, a shutter opening here, a voice there, the sound of something being dragged across cobblestones. Somewhere out of sight, the smell of a dozen morning fires threading through the cold air with the warm domestic certainty of people beginning their day. You stand in the street and breathe it in, all of it. The wood smoke and the bread and the river and the animals and the deep, earthen bass note of the ground beneath your feet. All of it together, the full, complicated, ancient chord of a city that has been alive since before anyone now living was born, and will be alive long after everyone now living is gone. It is not a clean smell. It has never been a clean smell, but it is a whole smell, a complete smell, a smell that contains within it the entire story of how people have lived together in close quarters and managed the impossible logistics of collective existence, and found ways imperfect and ingenious and stubborn and sometimes catastrophic to keep going. You have been here all night, and the city has shown you everything it has. Its workers and its waste, its sacred spaces and its sanitary disasters. Its wealthy carrying their pomanders and its children sleeping in doorways. Its regulatory notices flapping against stone walls and its gong farmers, working in the dark with the quiet competence of the essential and the invisible. It has shown you the tanneries and the shambles and the cesspits and the river and the church and the market and the garderobe shaft in the castle wall. And it has shown you the cat in the bakehouse doorway, who has throughout everything maintained a position of absolute considered contentment. The cat has the right idea. It always did. The people of this city will wake today and do what they have always done, manage the unmanageable, adapt to the inadaptable, find humor in the catastrophic, and beauty in the unexpected, and warmth in the proximity of other lives being lived at close quarters in difficult conditions. They will complain about the smell and contribute to the smell and forget about the smell and remember it again when it exceeds even their adapted threshold. They will do their work and raise their children and pray in their incense-heavy churches and eat their smoke-flavored bread and carry their pomanders through the streets like small personal declarations that the world can be made at least in the immediate vicinity of the nose somewhat better than it is. And then the night will come again, and the gong farmers will start their rounds, and the city will breathe its deep organic breath into the dark, and somewhere across the centuries, very far away, in a room with clean air and soft sheets and the entire modern infrastructure of sanitation operating silently beneath the floor, you will be drifting towards sleep with the smell of a Madhyakaleen city in your memory, not as something terrible exactly, but as something real, something that reminds you what the world is made of, and what people are made of, and how much has been built between then and now, and how recently. Let that thought carry you now. Let the gray morning light soften into something warmer. Let the sounds of the waking city, the birds, the cartwheels, the distant voices, the creak of a shutter in the morning breeze, become the sounds of your own breathing, slow and steady and easy. You have walked a long way tonight through the cesspits and the tanneries and the shambles and the market and the church and the long, dark, layered streets of a world. Art no longer exists except in the ground beneath old cities and in the pages of the books that tried to describe it. And in moments like this one, when someone sits still long enough to really listen to what the past has to say,